Prepare for one of the most intense standoffs you've ever heard, where a lone homesteader transforms her quiet cabin into an impenetrable fortress against ruthless outlaws. From high-stakes shootouts at dawn to masterful strategies and narrow escapes, this story offers non-stop action rooted in courage and cunning. If you haven't listened to the entire narrative yet, trust us. You'll want every detail to see how the final confrontations unfold and discover who ultimately prevails. Before we dive into these new parts, make sure you hit that subscribe button to support our channel and stay tuned for more heart-pounding tales. We appreciate every subscription and comment, and we'll keep bringing you stories that fuel your imagination. A brisk wind whistled among the towering evergreens as a lone figure named Marisol Graywood stepped onto the worn wooden porch of her secluded cabin. The structure stood on a high ridge just outside Evergreen Gap, a modest frontier settlement nestled in the Colorado Territory's rugged landscape. It was early morning, the first traces of daylight stretching fingers of pale gold across the horizon. Marisol, her dark hair gathered in a practical twist, wore a faded green shawl over a sturdy dress. Anyone watching might mistake her for just another mountain widow resigned to a life of solitude. They would have missed the calm vigilance in her gaze, or the sure, deft way her hands handled the Winchester rifle resting across her lap. At 47, Marisol Graywood might have appeared weathered by life's hardships, but behind her reserved demeanor lay a world of hidden skill. Few who passed through Evergreen Gap knew her real background. She had once been a legend in the Union Army's Spectre Corps, a clandestine sharpshooter unit assigned to high-risk infiltration and intelligence missions during the Civil War. Trained by specialists handpicked by General Ulysses S. Grant, the Spectre Corps performed tasks that officially never happened, vanishing like ghosts into enemy territory. Marisol had been among the most effective of them, a name spoken only in whispers. Shade Song, they called her, for her uncanny ability to blend into darkness and strike with unerring aim. Her life had not always been one of secrets and shadows. Before the war, Marisol had married Edgar Graywood, a federal land agent with a passion for fair governance. Together, they had dreamed of venturing west, where Edgar believed new beginnings beckoned honest settlers. But the war shattered those dreams. Marisol's extraordinary marksmanship was discovered by a visiting Union officer, and her path veered away from domestic bliss. She spent 3 grim years prowling contested territories, dismantling Confederate supply lines, and gathering intelligence crucial to Union victories. Meanwhile, Edgar had continued his government work, investigating suspicious land claims and forging alliances to protect legitimate homesteaders. Only after Appomattox did Marisol return to Edgar, carrying the emotional toll of her clandestine service. Hoping to find the peace they both deserved, they traveled to the Colorado frontier, but life's cruelties had not finished with them. While looking into what he termed corrupt land speculations, Edgar suffered a fatal accident, one that Marisol never fully believed was accidental. She buried him in the clearing behind the cabin they had begun constructing together, determined to see his dreams of an honest, lawful territory realized. Although still grieving, she harnessed her old Spectre Corps training to transform the homestead into something unique, a secret fortress masquerading as a humble widow's cabin. Each of its windows was reinforced with plated iron beneath layers of rough-hewn timber, the shutters locked from the inside with hidden bars, and every angle of approach from the forest had been meticulously measured. Over the past 3 years, Marisol fine-tuned each defense, camouflage tripwires, false floorboards set to give way under unwary trespassers, and stashed firearms strategically placed within reach. She kept her cabin unobtrusive, yet lethal to those who would threaten her or the legacy of her beloved husband. Unaware travelers saw a lone widow living simply, never suspecting that every loose stone and scrap of timber possessed its own tactical rationale. Despite her seclusion, Marisol maintained a modest connection to Evergreen Gap. On alternating Saturdays, she rode her sturdy dun mare, Hollis, into town for supplies and news. The settlement was typical of a growing frontier outpost, boasting a small but lively main street with a saloon, a blacksmith, a modest boarding house, and Whelan's general store, where the inhabitants gathered to trade gossip as eagerly as they did goods. Marisol kept her interactions polite but minimal. She was cordial when greeting neighbors, exchanging the usual small talk about weather or crop yields, yet she rarely lingered. This approach allowed her to gather crucial information, for instance, the talk of traveling outlaws or unscrupulous land speculators, without revealing too much about herself. Over time, the townsfolk forged their own narratives about the quiet widow on the ridge. Some suspected she was simply mourning her husband. Others whispered outlandish tales, that she had once been a spy, or that she had a hidden cache of Union gold. A few scoffed at such rumors, labeling them the typical tall tales of bored prospectors. Marisol neither confirmed nor denied any story. She found it beneficial for people to assume what they wanted. Since no single rumor gained outright credibility, she remained largely unbothered. It was during one of her afternoon trips to Whelan's General Store that Marisol first heard Jonah Ryder's name spoken in hushed, uneasy tones. Sheriff Hawthorne, an older man with a limp from an old cavalry skirmish, was cautioning a local rancher about Ryder's gang. They had been spotted in the next county over, rumored to be forcing homesteaders to abandon prime land. Some they threatened, others they bribed, and those who resisted met with violence. "He calls himself a businessman," Sheriff Hawthorne had said with a slow shake of his head. "But from all accounts, Ryder's just another old Confederate officer who refused to surrender when Lee did." When Marisol heard that Jonah Ryder was rumored to be connected to Sebastian Morrison, a high-powered railroad magnate known for snapping up land by any means necessary, she felt a cold tension coil in her gut. The name Morrison had haunted her late husband's private notes, which Marisol had discovered after Edgar's death. She remembered how Edgar had gathered a wealth of evidence implicating Morrison in elaborate land frauds, bribing officials to overlook legal discrepancies while sending hired guns to strong-arm reluctant settlers. Edgar's steadfast ethics had likely marked him as a danger to men like Morrison, and could well have led to his accident. Marisol bought her usual provisions that day: flour, nails, coffee beans, and a spool of thread, then quietly inquired if anyone had glimpsed Ryder or his men near the outskirts of town. The general consensus was that they were still a few days' ride away, a threat on the horizon, but not an immediate crisis. Even so, Marisol kept her ears open, gleaning details from hushed voices and worried glances. By the time she remounted Hollis, she had collected enough tidbits to form a plan should Ryder's gang venture near her ridge. When dusk fell and the general store's lights dimmed behind her, Marisol urged Hollis into a steady canter along the moonlit trail back to her homestead. A crisp breeze swept through the stands of pine, bringing a faint scent of wood smoke. Tension lingered in the air, a soft warning that trouble was looming. Marisol vowed that if Ryder and his men did come, they would find more than a grieving widow. They would encounter the cunning defenses of a woman who had been trained by the Spectre Corps and had lost far too much already to surrender anything else without a fight. A week passed before the next rumor reached her. Word spread that Jonah Ryder's gang had attacked 2 remote cabins in a neighboring valley. One structure was destroyed with a torch set late at night. The family survived but lost their barn, livestock, and nearly all their stores for winter. The second property, belonging to an older couple, had been forcibly taken after the residents were threatened at gunpoint. Sheriff Hawthorne, overworked and short-handed, sent telegrams pleading for federal marshals to intervene. But the territory was vast and resources thin. If Ryder's gang decided to appear near Evergreen Gap, the sheriff and his few deputies would be sorely outmatched. Marisol remained vigilant. She fortified her cabin further, ensuring that window shutters could be latched within seconds. A line of carefully planted shrubs concealed a tripwire along the east approach, rigged to ring small bells hidden within hollowed logs. She hauled extra water from the creek to fill barrels near both the front and rear entrances, anticipating that an attacking gang might try to smoke or burn her out. Within her home, Marisol spread her 5 firearms: the trusty Winchester, 2 sidearms, a scattergun, and a second rifle, across strategic locations. She double-checked her ammunition and practiced the swift reloading motions she had perfected during her wartime assignments. Often she paused to glance at the portrait of Edgar that sat on the mantel. It was a simple charcoal sketch a traveling artist had made years earlier, capturing his thoughtful eyes and the gentle smile he wore when speaking of the honest frontier he believed possible. Sometimes Marisol silently told him the day's developments, as though he were still there to share his unwavering support. She promised him that if Jonah Ryder was indeed in league with Sebastian Morrison, this time the criminals would not escape legal consequences. On a crisp afternoon, Marisol ventured deeper into the forest to set up an additional observation point on a low bluff overlooking the main trail. She carried a spyglass in her saddlebag, relic of her service in the Spectre Corps. With it, she could see riders approaching from miles away, an advantage that no ordinary homesteader would possess. She spent hours cutting branches to camouflage a small ledge and flattening a spot where she could comfortably lie prone, scanning the distance without being seen. Near sundown, she caught sight of 5 men on horseback, riding in tight formation. They were still far off, just faint silhouettes against the amber sky. Although she was too distant to hear their voices, something in their bearing raised her suspicions. They paused at a creek crossing, conferred briefly, then split into two groups. One trio headed south, and the remaining two riders headed northeast, directly toward the narrower trails that wound closer to her property. Marisol's heart beat faster. That kind of coordinated movement suggested at least a semblance of military discipline. From her vantage point, she observed them for a long time, ensuring she did not move enough to catch their attention. When the light grew too dim for accurate tracking, she quietly retreated, leading Hollis along a roundabout route back to the cabin. That night, sleep did not come easily. She kept visualizing the men on horseback in the cool, practiced way they split ranks to reconnoiter different paths. In her gut, she felt the rising certainty that Jonah Ryder was finally drawing near, and he would not be coming to negotiate peaceful terms. The next morning dawned cold and clear, frost glazing the cabin's small windows. Marisol rose before first light to tend her chores with purposeful haste. She heated water for coffee on the iron stove, mentally reviewing the map in her head. Edgar had once shown her how to envision landmarks, ridgelines, and creek bends as if viewing from above, a technique he had used to track unscrupulous land barons forging claims. She had refined that skill in the Spectre Corps, memorizing entire swaths of terrain behind enemy lines. Now she turned that practiced mind's eye to scanning every ravine and path that might provide easy cover for armed men. Shortly after sunrise, Marisol heard the distant sound of hooves. The hair on the back of her neck prickled. She loaded her sidearm and slung the Winchester across her shoulder, slipping quietly out the rear door. Moving in a crouch, she used the tree trunks behind her cabin as a natural barrier, weaving through pines and emerging beside a low outcropping of rock. From there, she peered through a small gap in the branches. She saw 3 riders, perhaps a quarter-mile away, picking their way toward her stable. The man in the lead was tall, lean, and carried himself with an unmistakable authority. He wore a black coat and, even at this distance, exuded calm confidence. Marisol guessed this had to be Jonah Ryder himself. Behind him, a man with a limp slouched in the saddle, and another younger rider followed, scanning the surroundings. Their approach was not brash or rushed. It was measured, as though they anticipated a hidden threat. Marisol realized that they were likely scouting her property, verifying any sign of inhabitants or defenses. Retreating deeper into the woods, she made a careful arc around the clearing, determined to stay out of sight until she found a vantage point behind a massive cedar. From there, she could see the men dismount at the edge of her front yard. They conversed in low voices, their expressions grave. The younger fellow, seemingly in his early 20s, knelt to examine the ground near the stable door. Marisol's chest tightened. He was searching for footprints, likely concluding from the hoof marks that only one horse was housed inside. A single occupant, presumably the widow rumored to be living alone. Jonah Ryder then lifted his head, scanning the perimeter of the cabin with the practiced gaze of someone who knew how to assess a defensive structure. He pointed toward the windows, and his companions nodded. Marisol suppressed a grim smile. They were about to discover that her windows had been modified into near-perfect rifle vantage points. Yet it was not the time for confrontation. She let them gather their impressions, confirm she was not in immediate sight, and eventually mount up. In a few minutes, the trio retreated, likely intending to regroup or report back. Marisol watched their departure with a mixture of relief and dread. The fact that Ryder himself had come meant that the interest in her land was more than casual. It also meant that the methodical infiltration she had expected was underway. She returned to her cabin, heart pounding, resolved to give them the fight of their lives if they dared to return in greater numbers. Late that same day, Marisol fortified every major entry point for the long night ahead. She dragged a heavy wooden table in front of the door and pushed sturdy boards against the windows. She also positioned small lanterns behind carefully cut slits, allowing her to cast light outside without illuminating her own movements within. These were old tactics from nighttime operations in the war, how to create illusions of vulnerability while staying hidden. She placed her rifles at strategic angles so that if anyone attempted a forced entry, she could retaliate within seconds. Despite her preparations, Marisol could not fully quell the memories that bubbled to the surface. The rattling of boards against window frames reminded her of securing ramshackle buildings behind Confederate lines, trying to keep her squad safe while they huddled in enemy territory. She remembered the hush that would fall on her teammates, just a handful of the Spectre Corps at times, each one silent, uncertain of whether the next day would bring capture or success. The hush tonight felt eerily similar, except now she was alone, no comrades steady breathing beside her. As darkness enveloped the forest, the moon hung bright and silver overhead, lending an otherworldly glow to the treetops. In her silent vigil, Marisol occasionally stepped to a sliver of window, scanning the gloom for any sign of movement. She heard rustling among the pines, but it might have been deer. Hours passed without confrontation. Then around midnight, she heard something distinctly human, the muffled clank of metal on stone. Instantly on alert, she moved to the southwestern corner of the cabin, where she kept a rifle loaded and at the ready. With a small mirror angled outside, she captured a distorted reflection of three men creeping close. She recognized Jonah Ryder again, now accompanied by two different men. One appeared to be the limping fellow from before, perhaps named Shaw if the whispered rumors in Evergreen Gap were accurate. The other was heavier set, likely the one known as Bowen, rumored to have a cruel streak. They split apart, each trying to position themselves around a separate window. Marisol's heart thumped. This was a professional tactic. Spread out, find vantage points, and be ready to fire from multiple angles simultaneously. Easing the barrel of her rifle through the firing slit she had crafted weeks ago, she lined up the crosshairs on the figure she believed was Shaw. For several heartbeats, she debated whether to shoot to kill or to wound, all the while recalling Edgar's unyielding moral code. Killing, she had long ago concluded, was sometimes necessary, but always a last resort. In a flash, the men advanced further. One probed the window with a knife, attempting to wedge it open. Marisol decided on a warning. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack shattered the hush of the forest, and the bullet splintered wood mere inches from the intruder's hand. He jerked back with a startled curse. Immediately, the men dove for cover, cursing and scattering behind the stable, the water trough, or any structure that might protect them from return fire. A tense silence followed. Marisol held her breath, listening for footsteps or commands. She did not want a pitched gun battle if it could be avoided. Finally, Jonah Ryder's voice echoed through the night. "You've got skill, widow, but there's more of us than you. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Marisol did not respond. She had learned from war that letting the enemy doubt the occupant's strength could be a powerful advantage. Tonight, silence would serve as her best reply. When dawn approached, pale light seeping between the pines, Marisol found herself exhausted but unhurt and still in control of her cabin. She watched from the north window as Jonah Ryder and his men pulled back into the forest under the grayish sky. She suspected they would regroup, perhaps call in more of their number for a renewed assault. A short standoff was not enough to dissuade determined marauders, especially if Sebastian Morrison's money was behind them. After a quick meal of dried biscuits and strong coffee, she decided to assess the surroundings. Stepping outside with her rifle, she scrutinized the ground near the cabin walls. She spotted fresh footprints, cigarette butts, and scuffed marks where men had knelt for cover. One of the footprints, with a distinctive uneven wear on the boot heel, matched the rumored limp of Shaw. Another set, larger and deeper, she attributed to Bowen. Carefully, she skirted each window to ensure no booby traps had been left behind. She then moved toward the stable to check on Hollis. The mare seemed spooked but unharmed. Marisol whispered soothingly, running a hand along the horse's neck and checking the stall door. Ryder's men had not forced it open, probably assuming they could claim the horse later. Next, Marisol explored the tree line. She found no sign of a permanent camp, suggesting that Ryder's men had conducted a probing attack rather than a full-scale siege. Returning to the cabin, she reflected on how well her defenses had held up. The modifications she installed with Edgar's memory in mind had given her the upper hand. Yet she realized the men would come back. Jonah Ryder was not likely to let a prized piece of land slip through his fingers just because of a single night's repulse. If anything, the humiliating retreat would provoke him to more aggressive tactics. She spent the late morning writing two brief letters, both coded in a cipher taught to her long ago in the Spectre Corps. The first was addressed to Sheriff Hawthorne, explaining that Jonah Ryder's presence posed an imminent threat to Evergreen Gap. She named the suspected men with him, hoping it would help the sheriff piece together their location. The second letter was for Judge Harlan in Denver, a higher authority that Edgar had once tried to contact. Marisol outlined the specifics of Morrison's suspected role in orchestrating attacks on homesteaders, forging land claims, and eliminating key witnesses. Should anything happen to her, she wanted the information to surface. She sealed both letters and tucked them into the false bottom of a biscuit tin. If a passerby or neighbor friendly with Sheriff Hawthorne appeared, she would entrust the tin to them with instructions to deliver the letters. The arrangement was far from foolproof, but time was short and she needed every contingency in place. Before the sun reached its peak, Marisol moved quietly about her chores, every sense on high alert. The forest felt uneasy. No bird calls, no rustling of squirrels, just a profound hush as though nature itself was bracing for what might unfold. She had been in that hush before, during the war, in those moments before dawn raids when even the wind seemed to pause in anticipation of violence. That afternoon, Marisol was startled by the sound of a single rider approaching from the southern trail. Grabbing her rifle, she peered through a narrow gap she used as a lookout. To her surprise, she recognized the face. Nelson, the young stable hand who sometimes assisted at Whelan's general store, especially with newcomers' horses. His expression was anxious, and he held his hands in plain view, evidently hoping not to be mistaken for a threat. With a mix of caution and relief, Marisol unbarred her door to let him in. Nelson was breathing hard, sweat staining his shirt collar. "Ma'am," he panted, "the sheriff asked me to warn you. Some of Ryder's men have been spotted in the outskirts of Evergreen Gap. They've been asking after a, lonely widow who might need protection. Sheriff Hawthorne figures they mean you." Marisol offered him a cup of water, which he gulped down. She then guided him to a seat. "Did the sheriff give you any details about how many men are with Ryder?" she asked. Nelson nodded, sliding the cup between his palms. "He says at least 5, but rumors suggest more might be coming. They're trying to push folks off their land, or worse." Though she felt her pulse quicken, Marisol kept her face composed. Nelson was a decent young man, and she didn't want to alarm him with the depth of her war-honed instincts. "Tell the sheriff I appreciate the warning," she said. "Can you also give him something?" She retrieved the biscuit tin from her table, pulling out the letter addressed to Hawthorne. "Make sure he reads this right away. It details what I've seen of Ryder's movements." Nelson nodded gravely. "Yes, ma'am." But as he made to leave, Marisol hesitated, recalling the second letter tucked in the false bottom. She felt it unwise to burden him with that as well. If Ryder's men intercepted him, the letter to Judge Harlan might jeopardize both Nelson's life and the broader plan. Instead, she withdrew a separate sealed envelope from the tin's hidden compartment, quietly slipped it into an inside pocket of her apron, and decided she would find another method to get it out if possible. Sensing her concern, Nelson paused. "Anything else you need me to pass on? Any supplies?" "No," Marisol answered, forcing a reassuring tone. "You've done enough for now. Just ride carefully and keep an eye out for strangers on the trail. Ryder's men might try to question anyone leaving this property." "Understood, ma'am." Nelson rose, glancing around the cabin as if seeing it in a new light. The subtle reinforcements, the strategic shutter bars, the rifles placed just within reach. He didn't ask about it, but Marisol could tell he was puzzled. A small part of her wished she could explain everything, that she wasn't just some woman fending off outlaws out of naive courage. She was Shadesong of the Spectre Corps, a phantom sharpshooter who had navigated the deadliest corners of the war. But better to let him assume she was merely resourceful. Minutes later, Marisol watched Nelson ride away, unconsciously checking the horizon for suspicious figures. The air felt charged, as though a storm front hovered just beyond her sight. She shut the door and refastened the bars, her chest tightening with certainty that time was running short. Ryder and his gang would not settle for quietly gathering information. They would come in force, and soon. By twilight, Marisol's anticipation had sharpened into near certainty. The next few hours would likely bring Jonah Ryder's return. She dined on a simple stew of beans and salt pork, forcing herself to eat despite the tightness in her stomach. It might be her last real meal for a while, depending on how events unfolded. Afterwards, she methodically cleaned and oiled her firearms by lamplight, each motion practiced and sure, a continuation of the rituals she had performed countless times during the war. The cabin glowed warmly with lamplight, but it was a deceptive warmth. Marisol had positioned her lamps so they would silhouette the interior forms without fully exposing her. A casual observer from the outside might think the place underlit or poorly arranged, never suspecting that each beam of light was calculated to cast deep shadows in certain corners, perfect spots for concealment. Around 9 o'clock she heard it, the unmistakable sound of multiple riders. Unlike earlier approaches, this time they did not come sneaking. Hoofbeats thundered with deliberate force. Ryder's men wanted her to know they were here, and in numbers. Carefully, Marisol closed the shutters, slid a bar across them, and took up her position at a concealed firing port near the cabin's center. From that vantage, she could check mirrors angled to show different windows. In the faint glow of moonlight, she counted at least 5 silhouettes. She recognized Jonah Ryder's shape at the forefront, shoulders stiff with purpose. One rider carried a torch, which he held high, illuminating the group in flickering amber. From their right flank, she spotted 2 more men, bringing the total to at least 7. Possibly others hung back in the darkness. They did not appear to be amateurs. She saw them spread out in a half-moon pattern around the yard, establishing lines of sight. The scene reminded her of a cavalry tactic aimed at cornering smaller units. Jonah Ryder's voice echoed across the clearing. "Marisol Greywood, you're harboring property that doesn't belong to you. We've come to negotiate, or collect it if you choose to refuse." "Go away," Marisol called back, projecting resolve. "I have nothing you want, and if you try to take it by force, be prepared for consequences." A short bark of laughter came from the man with the torch. "Consequences? You're one woman," he sneered. "We got you surrounded." Marisol's finger hovered near the trigger of her rifle. She remembered the younger man from the stables, the one who had knelt to examine footprints. So, they had combined the scouting party with the main force. She inhaled slowly to calm the rush of adrenaline. The men might outnumber her, but they were on her turf, under conditions she had painstakingly shaped for years. Ryder raised a hand, and the ring of men halted. "We don't want blood, widow," he said, his tone sliding into a false cordiality. "Mr. Sebastian Morrison has offered a handsome sum for your land, enough to set you up somewhere safer. Why be stubborn?" Marisol's jaw clenched at the mention of Morrison's name. "You tell Morrison this land isn't for sale. Never was. Edgar Greywood died protecting the rights of honest settlers, and I won't dishonor him now." Silence descended. She felt every eye turned toward her cabin, like wolves circling a wounded deer. But they had misjudged her. She was no wounded deer. She was a fortress. If Ryder insisted on pressing forward, he would learn exactly how formidable that fortress could be. A standoff settled over the clearing, the only sounds a restless shuffle of horses and the whistle of wind through the pines. Ryder's men exchanged wary glances. They were clearly uncertain whether to risk a frontal assault. These sorts of gangs thrived by intimidation first, violence second, and rarely encountered a target that could genuinely fight back. Marisol waited, her breathing controlled, the muzzle of her rifle resting in the custom slot she had carved into the interior wall. For a moment, no one moved. Then a burly figure stepped forward. Bowen, she guessed, from the description of a stocky man with a mean streak. "Woman, you can't hold off all of us. You might get 1 or 2, but the rest will tear you apart," he growled. Marisol almost smiled. "I promise you, whoever comes through these walls first will regret it before they draw their last breath." Bowen snarled and turned to Ryder. "She's asking for it. Let's rush her." But Ryder didn't immediately order the charge. He seemed to be calculating. Even from her limited vantage, Marisol discerned that Jonah Ryder was no fool. He had recognized the lethal accuracy of her warning shot the previous night and suspected she was more than a mere farmhand with a rifle. At length, Ryder dismounted, handing the reins to one of his subordinates. He placed his hands on his hips, scanning the cabin's exterior. "We'll give you a chance to come out and talk this through," he called. "If you don't, We'll assume you've picked a fight you can't win." Marisol took a measured breath. It was time for a decisive demonstration. Without announcing her intent, she shifted from her vantage port to a side window, braced her rifle, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the handle of the torch one man carried, shattering the wood and sending the flames sputtering to the ground. Startled curses erupted from the group as darkness reclaimed the clearing. "What the— one of them exclaimed. Ryder lurched aside, his reflexes quick, though the shot had not been aimed at him. Bowen and two others scrambled back, momentarily unsure if the next bullet might take them in the leg or the head. Marisol allowed the shock to settle. Then in a calm voice, she announced from behind the shutters, "I told you, leave my land and we won't have trouble. Push me and I'll aim at something more vital than a torch handle next time." She heard shuffling as the men weighed their options. Some muttered about retreating, but others were too proud or too greedy to walk away. Ryder's voice cut through the bickering. "We do this systematically," he ordered, his tone calm, almost militaristic. "Bowen, circle to the right. Foster, take the left. Shaw, find cover and start shooting if she peeks out. Keep her pinned and we'll flush her out. Nadrawam." The mention of systematic tactics jolted Marisol's war memories to life. Ryder was employing a classic pincer maneuver combined with suppressive fire. The Confederates had used a similar method in the skirmishes near Kennesaw Mountain, where only cunning had saved her unit. In the present moment, cunning was exactly what she planned to employ again. She was on her home ground, with every vantage memorized and booby traps in place. Yet she also knew that once guns started blazing, her margin for error would shrink to nothing. Keeping low, Marisol darted to the opposite side of the cabin. She had set mirrors high in the corners, angled to let her observe multiple approaches without exposing her silhouette to a window. From one mirror, she watched Bowen moving to the right. From another, she caught Foster sneaking around the left flank, stepping carefully between tree stumps to avoid detection. Meanwhile, at least two men, likely Shaw and the younger Ryder, were preparing to lay down suppressive fire from behind fallen logs. She inhaled slowly, calming her pulse. She had learned in the Spectre Corps that breathing control was vital in tense situations. Too much adrenaline could lead to rushed decisions. Instead, you had to harness the adrenaline to keep your senses sharp and your wits agile. Methodically, she unlatched a small vent near the west wall, one she had installed for precisely this scenario. By pushing a panel outward, she created a narrow opening at shin height. From there, she could fire at anyone who tried to hug the ground while approaching. Through the vent, she glimpsed the flash of a boot. Bowen was closing in. She saw him signal to someone, likely Foster, indicating they should move in tandem. Ryder was orchestrating a pincer attack designed to force her into focusing on multiple threats at once, thereby making her easier to overrun. But Marisol was not a typical homesteader. She let her finger tighten around the trigger, waiting for Bowen to come into better view. A spurt of movement. Bowen lunged behind a large rock, attempting to flank her. Marisol exhaled, aimed for the ground a few inches from his foot, and fired. The bullet kicked up dirt, pelting his boots with pebbles and dust. He jolted back with a curse, dropping momentarily onto his hands and knees. By not aiming to kill, she nonetheless made it clear she could have. The clarity of that warning shot was not lost on Bowen. Simultaneously, from the north window, a loud crack signaled that Shaw had opened fire. Bullets rattled the shutters, some slamming into the thick timber. If Marisol had been naive enough to stand behind that window, she would have been riddled with holes. Instead, she pressed herself lower against the wall, adrenaline pulsing. Now the younger Ryder joined Shaw, sending a volley of shots into the upper half of the cabin. Wooden splinters and glass shards from small corner windows rained inside. The cabin groaned under the assault, but the reinforced materials held. Marisol caught a glimpse of lamp oil leaking from a jar she had used to create illusions of light. She swallowed a wave of apprehension, realizing a stray bullet could ignite the place. Foster made a sudden dash toward a cluster of trees on the south side, probably aiming to find a vantage point for a shot through the cabin's rear. Marisol cursed under her breath. If they gained multiple firing lines, her ability to maneuver inside would be compromised. She had to disrupt their plan. Jumping to her feet, she scrambled to the east window. In one fluid motion, she set her rifle on the sill, aimed at Foster, and fired just as he broke into the open. The shot tore through the edge of his coat, close enough to make him spin off balance, but again, deliberately non-lethal. He dove behind a fallen pine, panting. Another demonstration that within Marisol Greywood's domain, there was no such thing as safe cover. Shots whizzed around the cabin from multiple angles now, each muzzle flash revealing glimpses of Ryder's men crouched among the rocks and bushes. In the midst of the chaos, Marisol heard Jonah Ryder himself shouting commands with a chilling steadiness that reminded her of an experienced officer rallying troops. "Don't bunch up! Keep moving! Make her show herself!" His voice carried authority, and for a moment Marisol recognized the lethal synergy of a disciplined mind guiding unscrupulous men. A bullet punched through the shutter near her right shoulder, sending shards of wood across the floor. Gasping, she rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding a second round aimed at the same spot. The younger rider was improving his aim, likely guided by Shaw's cover fire. If she stayed pinned too long, they might work up the nerve to close in. She switched tactics. Hurriedly unhooking the scattergun from the wall, she moved toward the back door that led to a small enclosed yard. She had placed a series of tripwires there, each attached to a makeshift noise-making device. Ideally, if anyone tried sneaking around to breach the rear door, they'd set off a racket of tin cans and bells. But to ensure her advantage, she needed to double-check the lines. Crouching against the floor, she reached through a hidden compartment to pull on a taut wire, verifying it was still intact. Satisfied, she slung the scattergun across her back and slithered to the next vantage point on her belly, mindful of the gunfire outside. Through a narrow gap, she saw Foster regroup with Bowen behind a thick oak. They were clearly spooked by her unerring near misses, but Jonah Ryder was urging them on, perhaps pointing out that her cabin couldn't hold forever. Marisol's lips tightened. True, the cabin couldn't hold if they decided to starve her out or set it ablaze. She had strategies for that too, including water barrels and a hidden root cellar exit. Yet a part of her dreaded the possibility of a drawn-out siege. That kind of protracted conflict could lead to her eventual discovery by more powerful forces, including Morrison's higher-paid mercenaries. Another hail of bullets raked the corner of the cabin, forcing her to hunch lower. She exhaled shakily. The scene took her back to a mission outside Chattanooga, where she'd been pinned by Confederate sharpshooters for hours before outwitting them at dusk. Now, as then, her best chance was to sow confusion and exploit the terrain. She had intentionally let them see only a fraction of her capacity. Perhaps it was time to surprise them with the rest. She inched to the west wall and nudged open a hidden slot. This slot was connected to a pivoting mechanism that allowed her to drop small bundles outside without revealing herself. She had prepared something for such a standoff. Small charges of black powder wrapped tightly, each designed to create a loud explosion and thick smoke. Taking 2 of these, she lit their short fuses with a trembling hand and slid them onto the ground outside. Along the path she anticipated Bowen and Foster might take if they advanced. Then she waited, heart pounding, for the fireworks to begin. A scant few seconds later, a thunderous boom reverberated through the clearing as the first black powder charge detonated. Grayish-white smoke billowed upward, enveloping a cluster of tree trunks and partially obscuring Bowen's position. Shouts of surprise and alarm erupted as the men scrambled, uncertain whether they were under artillery attack or facing some hidden store of dynamite. The second charge ignited soon after, creating another plume of smoke that drifted toward the stable, making it nearly impossible for them to see each other, much less pinpoint Marisol's location inside the cabin. Seizing the opportunity, Marisol dashed to the north window. Through a gap in the shutters, she spotted Jonah Ryder wiping smoke from his eyes while shouting something to Shaw. She squeezed off a shot that struck the ground just inches from his foot, forcing him to leap back and stumble. Although she wasn't aiming to kill him outright, Marisol wanted Ryder to feel cornered, to realize his carefully orchestrated assault was unraveling. The confusion worked in her favor. 2 of the gang members, including the younger Ryder, who had been shooting from behind cover, began shouting for a retreat. They likely feared more hidden explosives. "We gotta pull back," one yelled. "This place is rigged." Bowen, his confidence badly shaken, bolted from the smoke with wide eyes, coughing violently. He had lost his hat in the chaos and looked dazed, as though uncertain which direction to run. Foster emerged behind him, likewise disoriented. Gunfire became sporadic as the men tried to reorganize in the swirling haze. Yet Jonah Ryder was not giving up so easily. Recovering from his stumble, He regrouped with Shaw and barked orders for a flank maneuver, presumably to circle around the cabin's perimeter and come at Marisol from the blind side. She caught glimpses of them darting through the trees. They would try to strike fast, relying on the smoke to conceal their movement. Realizing she needed to keep them guessing, Marisol hurried to the trap door in her kitchen floor. Below lay a shallow trench that extended several yards beyond the cabin's foundation. Edgar had helped dig it with the idea that it could serve as a root cellar extension. She had modified it after his death, turning it into a narrow escape route. While she didn't plan on fleeing, she could certainly use it to pop up behind her attackers. She lifted the trapdoor's latch and wriggled down into the passage, careful not to make noise. The walls were cool and damp. Darkness pressed around her. Moving on hands and knees, she navigated about 10 feet until she reached a small hatch that opened behind the woodpile. This vantage gave her a partial view of the southern approach. Pushing the hatch open a crack, she could hear Bowen and Foster cursing softly as they regrouped near the woodpile. They debated whether to withdraw entirely or wait for Ryder's signal. As they whispered back and forth, Marisol carefully positioned the barrel of her scattergun through the narrow gap. A single blast could incapacitate both men if they became too bold. But she hesitated, recalling her vow to kill only when absolutely necessary. She opted for another tactic. Taking a deep breath, she raised her voice so they could hear her from somewhere nearby. "I know Morrison's paying you, but do you really think he'll protect you once you fail him? He's known for cleaning up loose ends. Ask yourselves if you want to be his next casualties." Her words echoed in the smoky twilight. She heard Foster suck in a breath, unsure how to respond. Bowen made a low, indecipherable snarl of frustration. Meanwhile, the acrid smell of spent black powder hung in the air, and the swirling clouds of smoke began to thin. Marisol realized that if Ryder was directing a flank maneuver, he might be cresting the far side of her cabin any minute. She quickly retreated back into the subterranean crawl space, sealing the hatch behind her. She had gained valuable seconds to disrupt their formation, and now she needed to be back inside to meet Jonah Ryder head-on. Emerging quietly into her kitchen, Marisol bolted the trapdoor from above. She could still hear scattered gunshots outside, echoing off the trees in the receding smoke. Her mind raced. Either Ryder's flank attack would come from the east or the south. The pincer approach demanded coverage of both. Securing the scattergun over her shoulder, she hastily took up her Winchester, deciding its range and accuracy might be more crucial now. She pressed herself flat against the cabin's eastern wall, peering through a discreet spy hole she had drilled months ago. Movement caught her eye. Two silhouettes slipping between tall pines, trying to avoid open ground. She recognized one as Jonah Ryder's upright figure. Next to him, keeping low, was Shaw, the limp in his step making him lag behind slightly. They were making for a small outcropping of rocks, one of the few spots not covered by her window's direct lines of fire. If they took that position, they could potentially toss flaming torches or even dynamite, if they had any, toward her roof. A flash of memory sliced through her mind. An incident near Cold Harbor, where her Spectre Corps team had pinned down a Confederate supply train, but nearly lost everything when the enemy lobbed makeshift bombs over a fortification. The memory snapped her to action. If Ryder and Shaw reached those rocks, they could replicate that maneuver. Marisol raised the Winchester and aimed through the tiny hole, centering her sights on Jonah Ryder's torso. This time she hesitated less. She had given warnings, shown mercy by deliberately missing vital areas. But Ryder was too determined, and if he succeeded in an incendiary attack, her entire cabin, her entire life, would go up in flames. She lined the sights on his chest, controlled her breathing, and tightened her finger on the trigger. But before she could fire, Shaw tripped, stumbling into Ryder's path. They both fell behind a boulder, out of Marisol's immediate sight. She cursed under her breath, shifting her angle, but the boulder now shielded them. She heard Ryder mutter a muffled expletive, presumably furious at the misstep. Wasting no time, Marisol sprang from the wall and slid over to the south-facing window, pressing her eye to another small opening. She had predicted that if Ryder's flank was momentarily stalled, he might send others around to draw her attention. Indeed, she spied a figure crossing the yard swiftly. It was the younger Ryder, the one who had shown some marksmanship. He seemed to be heading toward the stable, likely planning to remove her horse or set the structure ablaze to flush her out. Her jaw clenched. She could not allow that to happen. If the stable went up, the entire property could be consumed by fire in minutes. Switching to the scattergun for its wider spread, she aimed at the young man's legs, tracking him as he neared the stable door. Then, with steely resolve, she pulled the trigger. The weapon boomed, and the figure jerked back, howling, as buckshot peppered the ground near his feet. Though not directly hit, he dropped to the dirt, stunned, his attempt at sabotage thoroughly foiled. Smoke curled from the muzzle of the scattergun, and the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in red and orange. The swirling gloom of powder haze clung to the yard, lending the confrontation an almost nightmarish quality. Marisol knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jonah Ryder still lingered near the rocks with Shaw, and the rest of the gang was scattered, likely recovering from the shock tactics she had unleashed. The stage was set for an even deadlier second wave. Marisol Greywood checked the light slanting through the western shutters and realized twilight was almost upon them. The sinking sun ignited the sky with a violent smear of crimson and gold, as if nature itself mirrored the bloodshed threatening to erupt at her cabin. Despite all her preparations, a twinge of anxiety gnawed at her. She had staked her life on meticulous defenses and well-placed illusions, but Jonah Ryder and his men were proving relentless. The sporadic gunfire outside had ebbed momentarily, giving Marisol a chance to relocate to a vantage point near the north-facing wall. She peered through the angled mirror system Edgar had helped design in theory before his death, and which she had perfected in practice. The reflection showed three of Ryder's men huddled behind a half-fallen pine, reloading their weapons and coughing from residual black powder smoke. She spotted Bowen's distinct bulk among them, his face creased with equal parts anger and confusion. About 10 yards to their left, Foster knelt with a bandaged forearm, likely from a graze earlier in the fight. Every so often, he glanced warily toward the cabin, as though expecting more booby traps or illusions. It gratified Marisol to see how jittery they all looked. Her tactics had successfully frayed their nerves. But she also noticed something else. They were talking animatedly, pointing toward the far side of the property, as if anticipating reinforcements or a new plan. Suddenly, a flicker of fire glowed from beyond the stable. Marisol's stomach tightened. Had they finally decided to try burning her out? She swiveled to another mirror that gave her a partial glimpse of the stable yard. No direct flames were visible, but an orange glow danced along the lower branches of nearby pines. She realized one of the men, likely the younger sharpshooter, was using a lantern and something else, perhaps oil. Bracing her rifle through the small, concealed slot by the windowsill, she trained the sight on that eerie flicker. The shapes moved too quickly to guarantee a clean shot, though. She breathed in and exhaled evenly, keeping her rifle steady as she timed the flicker's path. When the glow emerged into clearer view, she squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack rang out, and the lantern's light jerked wildly, then dropped. Angry shouts echoed in the dusk. Any hope of stopping them by demonstration alone evaporated when she heard Jonah Ryder's voice, cold and resolute, from somewhere past the pine trees. If she wants a war, we'll give her one. Don't hold back. Light up the stable. We'll see how well she shoots when she's choking on smoke. Marisol felt her heart pound. This was the moment she had dreaded. She had enough water barrels to battle a small blaze, but if the outlaws coordinated an arson attack from multiple angles, no single person could contain it. If she abandoned the cabin to protect the stable, they would swarm inside and kill her. If she stayed holed up, her horse, and eventually the cabin, could go up in flames. One desperate idea came to her: the root cellar extension that led beneath the stable. She had never fully tested it in a real combat scenario. It was cramped, dark, and perilous, but it might be her best chance to surprise the arsonists from below. Gritting her teeth, Marisol decided that if she did not act quickly, she would lose both the stable and her strategic advantage. She squared her shoulders and began making her way toward the hidden trapdoor, determined to outmaneuver Ryder's men before the fire took hold. She reached the trapdoor and slid it open, her lantern in hand. To avoid broadcasting her exact position, she turned its flame low, letting just enough light guide her down. The hidden passage sloped gradually under the floor, its walls supported by old wooden beams Edgar had scavenged from abandoned mining claims. Though solid, the corridor felt claustrophobic, pressing in on her with each step. Every foot of progress brought the muffled echoes of gunfire and shouting from above, as if reminding her that time was running short. She thought again of Edgar, how his pursuit of justice against Morrison had led him to his doom. In some ways, she was continuing his fight, but in others, she was forging her own warpath. She recalled how he had once said, "Civilization depends on those willing to stand up for the law." At the time, it had sounded so noble. Now, wading through dirt and darkness, it felt more like a lonely and lethal burden. When the cramped tunnel finally angled upward, she extinguished the lantern entirely, relying on her memory of the space. Slowly, she felt along the ceiling for the secondary hatch. Her fingers brushed the latch, and she paused, listening. Gunshots still rang sporadically from the cabin area, but closer at hand she could hear the faint crackle of flames. Her heart lurched. They had set something aflame near the stable, if not the stable itself. She drew a deep breath, braced her shoulder against the hatch, and pushed. The wooden door gave with a faint creak, opening into the tiny sub-stable crawl space. A rush of smoky air hit her, stinging her eyes. She coughed silently into her sleeve, trying to pinpoint where the men might be positioned. Through the thin slits in the stable's planks, she glimpsed a wavering glow. Flames danced near the stable's north side, not yet fully engulfing the structure, but definitely spreading. She spotted one figure stepping around the corner, brandishing a torch. Possibly the younger rider, but she couldn't be sure in the flickering light. Working quickly, Marisol eased her scattergun free. She knew better than to reveal herself completely. Instead, she angled the barrel through a gap in the boards close to ground level. Her vantage allowed her to see ankles and lower legs. An unconventional view, but perfect for a short, disorienting shot. She saw a pair of boots approach the stable door. With a measured squeeze of the trigger, she loosed a spray of buckshot at the ground near those boots. A yelp followed as the man stumbled, torch dropping to the dirt. Sparks leaped from the torch, but he scrambled away, clutching his leg. Wasting no time, she reached for the small burlap sack of sand she had stashed inside the sub-stable space. She threw open the hatch, hoisted herself up, and crawled toward the torch. With a determined swipe, she dumped sand over it, smothering the nascent flames before they could catch on straw or hay. Every second counted, because the men outside would realize she was in the stable. Just as she smothered the torch, another voice barked, "She's here! Take her out!" Bullets cracked into the stable wall, sending splinters flying near her head. Marisol dove behind a stack of feed sacks, her heart hammering. She had a momentary success, preventing a stable inferno. But now she was out of the cabin and in direct line of fire. She would have to rely on her wits, the stable's limited cover, and the hope that her booby traps around the property would keep the others from closing in too fast. Crouched behind the feed sacks, Marisol marveled at how quickly the stable had become a battleground. The structure smelled of scared horseflesh and singed wood, but at least the immediate flames were extinguished. Hollis, her Dun Mary, whinnied in alarm from the far stall, stomping the ground nervously. Marisol's chest tightened, recalling that if bullets started flying too wild, Hollis could be hit. She'd have to control the chaos somehow. Trying to keep her scattergun pointed toward the stable door, Marisol fumbled in her satchel for 2 small smoke bombs. Less intense than the black powder charges, but enough to obscure an enclosed area like this. She lit them in rapid succession and lobbed one toward the door and the other beneath a gap in the side wall. Grayish smoke hissed, ballooning outward. The immediate haze would confuse any shooter trying to enter. The door slammed open, and a pair of boots crashed in, a silhouette in the swirling smoke. Marisol's finger tightened on the scattergun's trigger, but a pang of conscience made her aim low again. She fired, hitting the intruder in the lower leg. He collapsed with a strangled cry, dropping his revolver onto the straw. Smoke roiled, and she couldn't see his face clearly, but she guessed from the shape it was one of Ryder's lesser-known henchmen. Before she could decide whether to finish him off or not, a second man darted around the corner, shooting blindly into the stable. Bullets whizzed over her head, embedding in the wooden posts. Hollis reared and kicked, her panic fueling Marisol's own desperation. She rolled sideways, feeling a sharp pain in her shoulder as it struck the hard ground. The new attacker coughed through the smoke. "She's in here! Close the door!" he yelled to someone outside. Marisol realized they intended to trap her inside. probably to either burn the place or force her into an impossible standoff. She had to act immediately. In one fluid motion, she grabbed her rifle from where it lay beside the feed sacks, brought it up, and fired a shot at the man's torso. It struck him high on the shoulder. Still not a fatal shot, but enough to knock him back against the stable wall, where he slid down, clutching at himself in pain shock. Two men neutralized, at least for the moment. Through the swirling smoke, she spotted a flicker of flame near Hollis's stall, likely from the man's dropped lantern or a stray ember. With a burst of adrenaline, Marisol lunged forward, using her boot to stamp out the small flame. The horse's eyes rolled in terror, but Marisol murmured soothing words trying to calm her. "Easy, girl. We'll make it through." Chaos reigned outside. She could hear shouting, some of Ryder's men apparently uncertain whether to storm the stable or regroup. "Ryder wants her alive," someone barked, only to be met with curses from another voice. Marisol's mind whirled. If they closed off the stable, she'd be pinned. The root cellar route was an option, but she had just come up through there, and the tunnel was too narrow to retreat easily under gunfire. Another possibility hammered at her thoughts. Break out. If she freed Hollis, she might ride through them in the confusion, though it would be a tremendous risk. She had done similarly reckless charges in the war, but always with a small squad covering her. Gasping for air, she double-checked that her rifle was loaded and that the two wounded men were down, but not a danger. Every second she hesitated, Jonah Ryder was surely planning a new tactic, or, worse, might be heading back to her cabin to rummage through her evidence or burn it down. She could not, would not, let that happen. Darting to Hollis's stall, Marisol unlatched the door and grabbed the mare's reins. The horse shuddered from fright, but with a firm hand, Marisol guided her through the swirling smoke toward the stable's main exit, ignoring the protests of her own bruised shoulder. This was the most direct way out, and if fate was on her side, she could break free before Ryder's men rallied. As Marisol edged Hollis forward, she heard a frantic scramble outside. One of Ryder's men slammed the stable door shut, likely hoping to corral her inside like a penned animal. Undeterred, she guided Hollis into a slow trot, gathering momentum. The stable door was old but reinforced. Crashing through it would not be simple. Marisol felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She whispered a tense reassurance to Hollis, urging the mare to accelerate. About 3 strides from the door, she hoisted herself into the saddle. No easy feat in the swirling smoke with her scattergun balanced across her thighs. The moment she was mounted, she nudged Hollis into a full run. The door loomed, a dark barrier in the haze, but she trusted the mare's strength. With a thunderous impact, Hollis's chest slammed into the door, cracking wood and snapping the makeshift latch. Splinters flew and the door burst open under the combined force of horse and rider. The sudden burst into open air stunned Ryder's men. At least 2 outlaws reeled backward, raising their guns in alarm. Marisol fired her scattergun to the left, peppering the ground near them and sending them diving for cover. Hollis galloped forward, clearing a pile of smoking embers that had once been a small stack of torches. Gunshots erupted from multiple directions. Marisol ducked low against Hollis's neck, trusting the mare's speed to carry them beyond immediate danger. She felt a searing pain graze her left calf, a bullet or a flying splinter. She couldn't tell which, but forced herself to stay steady. Several men shouted curses as she careened past, unable to get a clean shot in the chaos. Breaking free of the stable yard, she found herself on the edge of the property near a copse of pine trees. Hollis stumbled slightly, spooked by gunfire, but Marisol held the reins firmly. The horse's nostrils flared, inhaling the smell of smoke and fear. Marisol steered Hollis around a half-collapsed fence, trying to circle back toward the cabin from a different angle. She had to check on her carefully prepared defenses, especially if Ryder himself was in or near the cabin. The last thing she wanted was for him to rifle through her documents, discovering the ciphered letters and the hidden evidence that might put Morrison behind bars. Worse yet, if the men discovered her arrangement of tripwires, they might disable them or turn them against her. Rounding the tree line, she spotted movement near the cabin's north corner. Through a swirl of powder haze, Jonah Ryder's distinct figure came into view. He stood with his back to a large pine, pistol in one hand, scanning the area for Marisol. His hat was askew, his coat streaked with dust, but he still radiated controlled menace. Nearby, Shaw limped behind an overturned water trough, likely providing cover. Marisol's instinct screamed, now or never. She could fire from horseback, but her aim would suffer, and she might only wound Ryder. Alternatively, she could try to dismount for a steadier shot, but that would leave her vulnerable to Shaw or any others. She took a precious second to weigh the risks. A wave of tension swept over her. Every moment that passed allowed Ryder's scattered men to regroup. Gritting her teeth, she tapped Hollis's flanks and spurred the mare into a sharper turn, mind already envisioning the small blind spot behind a cluster of boulders. If she could reach that cover, she might dismount long enough to line up a rifle shot. Her body throbbed with pain, her shoulder bruised, her calf burning. But she clung to one certainty. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to lose this fight now. Ducking low in the saddle, Marisol guided Hollis behind the boulders. She dismounted in a fluid motion, though her bruised body protested. She tethered the horse to a low branch with a quick knot, leaving enough slack for Hollis to move but not bolt. From this vantage, she had partial cover from the pine tree that Ryder was using, but she needed a better angle to see Shaw behind the overturned trough. She carefully crawled forward, rifle in hand. The ground was uneven, scattered with pine needles and small rocks. In the distance, she caught muffled cries from the stable, likely the injured outlaws or possibly a final few trying to salvage their mission. The cabin itself remained stubbornly out of her direct line of sight. Smoke curled around the eaves, making her fear they'd set it ablaze, but she couldn't confirm without exposing herself. Her vantage improved when she reached a slope of hard earth overlooking the yard. Through the rifle's iron sights, she zeroed in on Jonah Ryder's broad shoulders. He seemed to be scanning for her horse, probably deducing she had broken free from the stable. Shaw crouched about 10 yards from him, partially obscured by the trough. Marisol exhaled slowly, just as she had done countless times in Spectre Corps operations. If she could eliminate Ryder, the rest might lose their nerve. Yet the memory of her father's words, "Never shoot a man in the back," flashed in her mind, mingling with Edgar's firm belief in lawful justice. She deliberated for a fleeting second, then called out in a steady voice, "Ryder, surrender or face the consequences." He spun around, startled. "Where are you, Greywood? Show yourself." Shaw peered over the trough, raising his pistol, uncertain of Marisol's location. She saw the tension in Ryder's stance, the mixture of fury and caution. "Your men are wounded," she continued. "Some might not survive if they don't get help soon. Drop your weapons and I'll let you ride out with them. Refuse, and I'll finish this." A bitter laugh escaped Ryder. "You think you're in any position to bargain? We outnumber you. Your homestead's about to be a smoking ruin." Despite his bravado, sweat glistened on his temple. Marisol noticed how he didn't deny that some of his men were badly hurt. That might be the key to unraveling what remained of his forces. She shifted her aim slightly to Shaw, who was edging to the left, possibly seeking a flanking angle. With crisp efficiency, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle's crack reverberated. Shaw jerked backward, a spray of dust erupting near his elbow. He grunted in pain and dropped out of sight behind the trough. Another clean, non-lethal hit. Ryder stiffened, clearly registering the unerring accuracy of Marisol's shot. She spoke again, voice echoing across the yard. "Last chance, Ryder. We both know Morrison sent you here, and we both know he discards anyone who fails him. Lay down your guns and leave, or stay and die for a man who sees you as expendable." A moment of silence followed, thick with tension. Marisol heard hoofbeats in the distance, possibly one of Ryder's men attempting to flee. Good. The fewer outlaws around, the better. If enough of them scattered, Ryder would have no choice but to follow or face her alone. At last, he shouted back, "You want me to give up? You come out and show yourself. I don't trust your word." His voice carried a ragged edge, doubt gnawing at his bravado. Marisol realized he might prefer a face-to-face confrontation, thinking he could outdraw her. But facing a fully trained sharpshooter at close range was even more dangerous than being targeted from afar. She clenched her jaw, acknowledging she might have to risk some measure of direct engagement if she hoped to end this siege for good. From behind the boulders, Marisol took stock of her resources. She had the Winchester with a few rounds left, her scattergun with a partial load, and a sidearm holstered at her belt. That sidearm was a relic from the war. a well-maintained Colt that had once belonged to one of her Spectre Corps comrades. She had become deadly accurate with it in close quarters. She decided on a bold gambit: approach Ryder in a half circle, staying behind cover as much as possible, and force a direct standoff. If she could get close enough, she might disarm him, or at least hold him at gunpoint. The possibility of Shaw interfering nagged at her. She had wounded him, but not fatally. He could still be dangerous. Easing away from her vantage point, she scooted back to Hollis and briefly stroked the mare's neck. "Stay calm," she whispered, as though the horse might respond with understanding. Then she looped around the boulders, moving as quietly as possible, mindful of every twig and dry leaf. Gunfire had mostly died down, replaced by the crackle of small flames lingering around the property. When she was halfway to the next cluster of cover, a stand of saplings near the cabin side, a loud snap of a branch made her freeze. She whirled, weapon at the ready, to see a terrified young outlaw stumbling through the underbrush. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, and his eyes went wide upon realizing who he had nearly run into. "Don't shoot!" he cried, tossing his revolver aside. He raised shaky hands in surrender. "I'm done, I swear. Bowen's down, Foster's run off, half of us are hurt, and Ryder's lost his mind." Marisol kept her rifle trained on him, hard hammering. "Get out of here. Head south. Find a doctor for your men. If you cross me again, I won't miss." The young man nodded frantically and vanished into the trees, leaving behind a trail of snapped branches. She lingered, mind racing. If the rank-and-file outlaws were losing faith, Jonah Ryder was likely on the cusp of defeat, assuming he didn't rally them by some last-ditch tactic. She continued her approach, zigzagging between low shrubs. The ground sloped upward near a pine trunk that gave a partial view of the trough. She risked a glance and saw Shaw lying on his side, pressing a bloody cloth to his upper arm. He looked pale but still alert enough to shoot if provoked. Ryder himself remained upright, shifting from foot to foot as though uncertain whether to flee or fight. Swallowing the dryness in her throat, Marisol rose partially above the pine trunk. Her voice cut the tension like a blade. "Ryder, your men are abandoning you. Throw down your weapon." She expected defiance or curses. Instead, he pivoted sharply, leveling his pistol in her direction and firing twice. She ducked just in time, bark splintering above her head. Ryder's reflexes were faster than she expected, and it sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She realized the niceties of negotiation were over. He was cornered, and cornered predators don't surrender easily. Steeling herself, Marisol adjusted her stance, finger on the Winchester's trigger, prepared for the final confrontation she had tried to avoid, but now could no longer escape. Jonah Ryder fired again, the bullet skimming the pine trunk and lodging in the earth behind her. Marisol felt the jolt through her boots. Every shot reminded her of the men she had faced in the war, some far more skilled than Ryder, but none as personally motivated to see her destroyed. She ducked behind the trunk, took a measured breath, and pivoted out to return fire. Her shot grazed Ryder's coat sleeve, so close it tore the fabric. He staggered but kept his footing, snarling in frustration. Behind him, Shaw groaned, trying to crawl farther behind the trough, clearly unwilling to risk more bullets. He had no illusions of victory now. Survival was his only aim. Just then, another figure emerged from the smoke near the corner of Marisol's cabin. It was Bowen, the burly man rumored to be among Ryder's fiercest enforcers. He limped heavily, one arm dangling as if injured, but his eyes burned with raw hatred. Marisol had thought him neutralized, but evidently not. He spotted her and raised a revolver in a shaking grip. She was pinned between Ryder and Bowen, a lethal crossfire if they coordinated. "Ryder!" Bowen shouted, voice ragged. "Let's end this. We can still put her down. Morrison's gold." Before he finished, Marisol fired at Bowen. The shot rang true, catching him in the thigh. He howled, collapsing to one knee. He tried to lift his weapon again, but his wounded arm spasmed. Blood seeped through the rough fabric of his pants, and for a moment his eyes met hers. She saw in them a flicker of fear that replaced his bravado. "Stay down," she barked, shifting her aim back to Jonah Ryder. "Bowen, your next move decides whether you live or die." She half expected Ryder to exploit her distraction, but instead he glared at Bowen with utter disgust. as though blaming his lieutenant for failing. Marisol seized that second to reposition herself, rolling behind a low stump for better cover. When Ryder refocused on her, he fired blindly, bullets pinging off rocks and scattering dirt. She waited for him to empty his chamber. Sure enough, she counted the shots, a skill honed in the war. After the sixth shot, a telltale click revealed Ryder had spent his ammunition. In that split second, Marisol stood, rifle aimed unwaveringly at his chest. "Drop it," she commanded, her voice as sharp as the biting wind. His lips curled into a hateful snarl. "Go on, shoot." "I'm giving you an out," she said through clenched teeth. "You might see a court if you surrender. Otherwise, you bleed out on this ridge, courtesy of your own arrogance." Ryder's gaze flickered between Marisol's rifle and the faintly smoking ruin of the stable yard. He saw Shaw incapacitated, Bowen wounded on the ground, and no loyal men nearby to rescue him. The hatred on his face flickered into something like resignation. Slowly he let the pistol fall from his hand, the empty cylinder clacking against a stone. A hush descended over the yard, punctuated only by the crackle of dying flames and the distant whinny of a frightened horse. Even the wind seemed to pause. Marisol kept her rifle raised, every muscle taut. She had dreamed of this moment, Jonah Ryder undone, forced to face justice for the horrors he had inflicted. Yet standing there, rifle barrel pointed at his heart, she felt an unexpected pang of conflict. Edgar would have wanted him tried in a court of law, not gunned down in cold blood. "Kick it away," she ordered. Ryder complied, nudging the pistol aside. Slowly she advanced on him, aware that behind her, Bowen might attempt some last-ditch move. Her senses stayed on high alert. The fight was nearly over, but the final steps were often the most treacherous. Marisol held Ryder at gunpoint while scanning the yard for signs of other threats. Shaw lay prone, moaning softly but making no move to raise his weapon again. Bowen glowered from where he knelt, blood staining his pants. A few yards away, one of Ryder's men lay unconscious, or possibly worse, and scattered among the pines, wisps of gray smoke drifted from small fires that had never gotten the chance to rage out of control. "How many more of your men are left?" she demanded. "I saw some flee. Are any more returning?" Ryder coughed, eyeing her bitterly. "2 or 3 unaccounted for. Might still be near the stable or the trees, but they'll run once they realize it's lost." Marisol believed him. Anyone with sense had already abandoned Ryder's lost cause. She flicked her gaze to the pistol lying on the ground. "Kneel, hands behind your head." Glaring, Ryder did as told. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and withdrew her sidearm, keeping it trained on him as she pulled a length of rope from her belt. Typically, she used this rope for basic tasks around the homestead, but it would serve to bind his wrists well enough. She moved behind him cautiously. Adrenaline surged through her veins, making her movements precise. With Ryder restrained, she backed away quickly, the sidearm never wavering. "Bowen, toss your gun to me." He stared defiantly until she aimed at his chest. He relented, sliding a revolver across the ground. "Now keep your hands where I can see them," she ordered. Bowen spat on the dirt, eyes flickering with fury, but he complied, resting his arms atop his thigh. Blood pooled in the dust beneath him. If he tried anything, he'd likely pass out before harming her. Breathing hard, Marisol took in the aftermath. The entire yard looked like a battlefield from the war. Spent shells glinting, torches half burned, a few men writhing with injuries. Hollis stood near the boulders, trembling but unhurt. The cabin's shutters were pockmarked with bullet holes, though it appeared not to be burning. Relief coursed through her. She had defended the homestead. Her next concern flared. What if Sebastian Morrison had dispatched more mercenaries to clean up if Ryder failed? The magnitude of that threat made her want to consolidate everything, evidence, letters, and the immediate scene, before any new arrival complicated matters. She needed help to secure these wounded men and ensure they face proper justice. With Ryder on his knees, she circled him to face her. His bravado had waned, replaced by a scowl of resignation. "Morrison abandoned you the moment you botched this job," she said quietly. "You were never more than a hired thug to him." He said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes suggested he knew she was right. From the corner of her vision, she saw Shaw move slightly, wincing. She barked, "Don't even think about it," and he froze. She decided she needed to secure him too, though he was less of a threat. Gesturing with her sidearm, she signaled for Shaw to slide toward the water trough. He did so, gritting his teeth. Not one among them tried to claim innocence or protest that they were simply following orders. Perhaps they realized it would fall on deaf ears. Marisol wondered if any remorse stirred within them, or if they simply hated that a lone widow had bested them. Overhead, the red glow of dusk had softened into a bruised purple, night descending on the battered property. "All right," Marisol murmured grimly. "Time to drag you inside, lock you up, and get word to the sheriff. You can explain yourselves to the law, assuming you live that long." It was a hollow victory, but a victory nonetheless. She had protected her land, at least for now. The memory of Edgar's death haunted her, tempering any sense of triumph. This battle was won, but the war might continue, especially if Morrison directed new forces to finish what Ryder had failed to do. As darkness settled in earnest, Marisol found herself performing duties she never anticipated when she first arrived in the Colorado frontier, namely corralling multiple wounded outlaws and deciding whether to treat them or let them bleed. She settled on a balance between compassion and caution. After forcing them to relinquish all weapons, she used rope from her barn supplies to bind their ankles loosely enough for blood flow, but not for escape. For those with gunshot wounds, she applied rudimentary first aid, cleaning and wrapping injuries with strips of torn cloth. Ryder's bullet grazes were minor. He had spent more time commanding than engaging her directly. Bowen required more attention, his thigh wound bleeding steadily, and he spat curses each time she tightened the makeshift bandage. Shaw was pale and sweaty, favoring his arm. The younger henchman who had survived had mostly fled, leaving only one unconscious near the stable. Marisol dragged him inside as well, checking that he still breathed. By the time she finished, she was exhausted. The cabin's main room resembled a wartime field station, with men groaning on the floor, some tethered to heavy furniture. This was hardly how she envisioned her quiet homestead to look, yet a sense of grim determination settled over her. These men would face justice, and their presence here meant they couldn't harm anyone else tonight. Stepping away from the outlaws, she fetched a lantern and climbed onto a stool to examine the bullet holes in her shutters. Some were superficial, others had punctured clean through. The walls remained sturdy, thanks to the layered reinforcements. She walked from window to window, mentally cataloging what repairs would be needed. Despite everything, the cabin had held up admirably. Ryder watched her in silence. Occasionally, Bowen muttered under his breath, or Shaw let out a pained hiss, but Ryder said nothing. Perhaps a tactical man once, he now seemed resigned or deep in thought. Finally, he spoke in a low tone. "You had this place rigged like a fortress. Why? Who does that?" Marisol paused, glancing at him. "A woman who lost her husband to men like Morrison. Greedy, powerful men who think nothing of trampling honest people for land." Ryder gave a derisive snort. "Morrison sees opportunity. You can't stop progress." "Progress? Destroying homesteads, threatening families?" She shook her head. "My husband collected enough evidence to bring men like Morrison down. He died for it. I won't let that go unanswered." The front door rattled suddenly, and Marisol spun, sidearm in hand. 10 seconds passed before she heard a timid voice call out, "Mrs. Graywood, it's Nelson. Don't shoot." Marisol hurried to unbar the door, letting the stable hand slip inside. He carried a lantern and looked about in dismay at the bound, wounded outlaws. "Sheriff Hawthorne's on his way," he announced, eyes wide. "Got a telegram from a passing rider who said you were in trouble up here. The sheriff and a few deputies are coming, but it might take them till morning." Marisol exhaled. Relief washed over her. With the sheriff's arrival, these men would be taken into custody properly, and she could finally share Edgar's evidence with Hawthorne. Perhaps then, the path to dealing with Morrison's broader schemes would be clearer. "Thank you, Nelson," she said softly. She gestured for him to step carefully around the injured outlaws. "Help me keep watch. If any of these men try something, we'll have to handle it ourselves until the law arrives." Night stretched on with an eerie quiet, broken only by occasional groans from the injured, and the crackle of embers still smoldering outside. Nelson stoked a small fire in the cabin's hearth to ward off the chill. Every pop of burning wood made Marisol twitch, her nerves still raw from the gun battle. Bowen, in obvious pain, cursed anyone within earshot, though his insults had lost their earlier bite. Shaw drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish. The one unconscious henchman stirred but didn't fully wake. likely too dazed from the blow to his head. Jonah Ryder remained stoically silent, his gaze distant. Nelson, younger and less hardened by violence, stared at Ryder with curious revulsion. "How'd you get mixed up with that railroad tycoon?" he asked, looking from Ryder to Marisol for an explanation. Ryder finally spoke, voice low and tight with bitterness. "After the war, I had no land, no prospects. Morrison needed men with, shall we say, discipline. We cleared a few properties. He paid well. It became a routine, one I was good at." His lips twisted into a cynical smile. "Until I wasn't." The admission hung in the air. Marisol felt a swirl of anger and pity. So many men had emerged from the war with shattered lives, turning to outlaw work for survival or revenge. It didn't absolve them of their crimes, but it painted a more complex portrait. She hunkered down near the fireplace and asked quietly, "Where does Morrison get his authority? Bribed officials, forgeries, or both?" Ryder rolled his shoulders, testing the rope's tightness. "Both. He's got half the territorial clerks in his pocket, and a few federal agents as well. At least that's the rumor. He forges land titles, then bribes judges to sign off on them. Anyone who doesn't comply ends up facing men like me, or ends up dead." Nelson shuddered. "Sounds bigger than anything Sheriff Hawthorne can tackle on his own." Marisol nodded. "That's why I wrote to Judge Harlan in Denver. Edgar was building a dossier on Morrison, with signed affidavits and proof of forged claims. If enough evidence reaches the right people, Morrison could be indicted." Bowen's labored breathing interrupted them, and Marisol tossed Nelson a cautious look. "We should check his bandage," she said reluctantly. "If he bleeds too much, he won't make it to trial." The stable hand gave a hesitant nod, kneeling next to Bowen to inspect the wound. Bowen grunted, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Marisol watched carefully, sidearm resting on her thigh in case he tried to lash out. Jonah Ryder studied them. "You're not like other folks out here," he remarked grudgingly, directing his words at Marisol. "I've seen men with less skill lose entire platoons in the war. Who trained you?" She paused, considering how much to reveal. "I was part of a clandestine unit. We specialized in infiltration, sabotage, sharpshooting." She didn't name the Spectre Corps. That moniker remained classified, though rumors had floated around for years. "You and your men stumbled into something you didn't expect. A solitary widow who wasn't so solitary after all, thanks to old training and carefully laid plans." Ryder let out a bitter chuckle, wincing when the rope tightened. "You could have killed us all. Why didn't you?" Marisol glanced around at the wounded men. "A last resort, as I told you. Edgar believed in justice, not slaughter. I won't tarnish his memory by executing helpless men." Ryder's gaze flickered with something akin to grudging respect. The stillness in the cabin pressed in on them, an uneasy peace in the aftermath of violence. Outside, the wind hissed through the battered trees. Tomorrow the law would come, and with it, the dawn of new battles, legal battles, that would define who truly controlled the land. As the hours crept by, Marisol and Nelson took shifts dozing near the fireplace. Neither dared sleep deeply, not with wounded outlaws bound on the floor. Periodically, Marisol rose to check each rope, ensuring that no one had loosened their restraints. Each time Ryder glowered, Bowen spat curses, and Shaw muttered deliriously, but they made no move to fight. Their injuries were too severe, and the gloom of defeat weighed on them. Shortly before dawn, the whinny of a horse broke the silence. Marisol jolted upright, sidearm in hand, fear pounding in her chest. Another of Ryder's men, returning, but a voice she recognized called out, "Easy there, it's me." She exhaled. Sheriff Hawthorne. Within minutes, the sheriff and two deputies stepped inside, lanterns in hand, looking around in grim astonishment at the bullet-riddled shutters, bloodstains, and the captured outlaws. "My God, Mrs. Graywood," Hawthorne breathed, removing his hat. "You did all this." Marisol shrugged off the praise. "They did it to themselves. I just prevented them from doing worse." Hawthorne eyed Ryder's rope-bound figure. "Jonah Ryder, you're under arrest for armed assault, land intimidation, and a half-dozen other charges I can think of. Might be more once I talk to these men." He signaled to his deputies, who moved to secure the prisoners with sturdier manacles. When they reached Bowen, The sheriff gave a low whistle at the man's blood-soaked pant leg. "He needs a doctor, or he won't make it to a cell," Hawthorne noted. "We'll transport him to Dr. Fisher's place in town." Marisol glanced at the battered stable hand Nelson, who hovered near the fireplace with relief etched on his face. "Nelson, could you ride with them? Help keep an eye on these men. Make sure they don't bleed out or escape on the way?" The young man nodded eagerly, apparently relieved that official law enforcement was finally present. "Yes, ma'am." As the deputies bustled about, binding wounds and preparing the outlaws for transport, Hawthorne approached Marisol. "I'm grateful we arrived to find you still standing. By all accounts, these were dangerous men. But from the look of it, you could have repelled a small army." His gaze flicked to the bullet holes in the makeshift barricades. She inclined her head, weariness creeping over her. "It was close at times. They nearly torched my stable." The sheriff shook his head. "I'll be sure to note the property damage in my report. You got my letter from Nelson?" Marisol nodded. "I've also written to Judge Harlan in Denver. My husband compiled evidence against Sebastian Morrison, who I strongly suspect hired Ryder. I'm hoping that between your testimony, the outlaw's statements, and Edgar's records, we can finally bring Morrison to justice." Hawthorne's lips pressed into a grim line. "I knew Edgar was onto something big before he died. We tried investigating, but too many doors were shut in our faces. If we can tie Ryder's testimony to Morrison's forgeries and intimidation, that might be the crack in Morrison's armor we need." Jonah Ryder, overhearing, gave a harsh laugh. "Morrison has half the territory in his pocket. You'll never pin him down." Marisol stepped closer, leveling a calm stare. "We pinned you down. That's a start." The sheriff watched this exchange thoughtfully. "If we move fast, we might catch Morrison before he hears about Ryder's failure and covers his tracks." He turned to Marisol, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Graywood, I might need your help. You have a knack for strategy that would benefit the marshal's office if we go after Morrison." She took a measured breath, recalling the vow she made over Edgar's grave. "I'm willing. Tell me what you need." A faint light began to bloom outside the windows. Dawn had arrived. An uncertain dawn, but one that brought with it the promise of legal retribution for the corrupt. And though her fortress stood scarred, Marisol felt more resolved than ever to see Edgar's dream of honest governance realized. The following day passed in a blur. Hawthorne and his deputies loaded Jonah Ryder, Bowen, Shaw, and the unconscious henchman onto a makeshift wagon that rattled slowly down the mountain trail toward Evergreen Gap. 3 other outlaws were still unaccounted for, but Hawthorne believed they'd either fled the territory or crawled off to nurse their wounds in secret. Marisol watched the wagon depart from her porch, exhaustion pressing on her like a physical weight. The cabin's yard bore the scars of the siege, blackened patches of earth where torches had burned, fresh wooden splinters scattered from shattered shutters. Hollis's stable door hung crooked on its hinges. Yet for all the damage, the property still stood. She found a sort of battered pride in that. Inside, Nelson helped her gather the leftover weapons, rifles, revolvers, shotguns the outlaws had discarded. Hawthorne had asked her to store them temporarily until the investigation concluded. After sorting them in a corner, Nelson offered a tentative smile. "I never realized you were so—" His voice trailed off, searching for the right word. Marisol raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous?" He flushed. "Capable, like a soldier." "Some scars don't fade," she replied simply, finishing her inventory. She didn't elaborate. The young man didn't press further. A quiet understanding had formed between them, something akin to respect. By late afternoon, Nelson bid her goodbye, riding after the sheriff to assist with any final tasks in town. Marisol felt oddly relieved to be alone again, though she knew the solitude would be short-lived if Hawthorne returned with a request to help chase down Morrison's operation. Needing to reclaim some normalcy, she spent the rest of the day performing routine chores, fetching water, cleaning the cabin floor where blood had pooled, hammering a few loose nails back into place. Each swing of the hammer reminded her of the firefight, making her flinch involuntarily. But she forced herself to push through, methodically restoring what she could. As dust settled once more, she set a kettle on the stove for tea, her body aching with every movement. The realization that she had survived, again, stirred mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also a renewed sense of duty. She recalled Edgar's face in that old charcoal portrait. What would he say about her risking her life in a fierce gun battle? Probably that he was proud, but also worried she might be consumed by vengeance. She stepped outside to watch the sunset. Lavender and rose hues stretched across the sky, accompanied by the faint chirping of crickets. The air smelled cleaner now, free of gunpowder. In the valley below, faint trails of smoke hinted at the evening fires in Evergreen Gap. A sliver of peace touched her heart, reminding her that life, even after so much violence, continued. Yet as she gazed out at the darkening frontier, Marisol couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She had neutralized Ryder, but Sebastian Morrison, the true architect, remained at large. Would he send more men once he learned of Ryder's defeat? Would local officials be swayed by Morrison's bribes again, leaving her vulnerable? She hoped that forging an alliance with the sheriff and Judge Harlan would finally turn the tide. But the seeds of doubt lingered, as they always did for those who had seen how ruthless the world could be. Days later, Marisol's routine was interrupted by a formal summons from Sheriff Hawthorne. A courier from Evergreen Gap arrived at her doorstep with a typed notice requesting her presence at a temporary hearing. The territory's federal marshal had arrived, the courier explained, and was interviewing witnesses about the attempted takeover of her homestead. More importantly, Judge Harlan was expected in a week's time to hear preliminary evidence against Sebastian Morrison. Reading the summons made her chest tighten. This was the moment she and Edgar had prepared for, exposing Morrison's treachery on an official stage. That night, she unlocked the small trunk in her bedroom, the one containing Edgar's meticulously kept records. Forged deeds, letters from coerced landowners, even a ledger tracking suspicious payments. She spent hours cross-referencing them with her own notes, ensuring everything was in order. She also retrieved the coded letter she'd intended for Judge Harlan, verifying each cipher. Memories of her Spectre Corps days washed over her. The discrete symbols, the hidden messages, the emphasis on exact precision. If she delivered these documents correctly, they could dismantle Morrison's entire operation. A morning's ride took her into Evergreen Gap for the hearing, which was held in the back room of the modest town hall. Hawthorne greeted her with a respectful nod, and she noted the presence of several deputies, the federal marshal, a broad-shouldered man named Hendricks, and Jonah Ryder, shackled and flanked by guards. Ryder's face bore signs of poorly healed cuts. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. Bowen, Shaw, and the unconscious henchman were apparently still under medical care. A few lesser outlaws had also been apprehended, but only Ryder was well enough to stand in this preliminary session. In a corner, a handful of onlookers, mostly local ranchers and curious townsfolk, crowded for a glimpse of the notorious outlaw. The marshal opened proceedings with a stern introduction, explaining that Judge Harlan was en route from Denver to handle the formal indictment. For now, Hendricks wanted sworn statements from Marisol and Ryder. Marisol stepped forward, heart pounding, to present her documentation. She watched with a mixture of apprehension and resolve as the marshal's eyes widened at the thoroughness of Edgar's ledger and the detailed notations linking certain bank drafts to Morrison's corporate accounts. When it was Ryder's turn, the outlaw slouched in his chair, hands cuffed. Under intense questioning from the marshal, he initially evaded or answered curtly. But when Marisol described, in detail, how she recognized leftover Confederate training in his tactics, the man stiffened. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth came out. Jonah Ryder had been given assignments by Morrison's intermediaries, always delivered by coded telegram or private messenger. The job, remove or scare off homesteaders, forcibly if necessary, so Morrison could claim the land cheaply. A hush fell over the room. The townsfolk murmured in anger and disbelief. Some had suspected corruption, but never realized it was so blatant and widespread. The marshal pressed for specifics, and though Ryder's reluctance was clear, he seemed to grasp that cooperativeness might lessen the gallows for him. By the session's end, the evidence was damning enough that the marshal officially announced an arrest warrant for Sebastian Morrison, pending Judge Harlan's signature. Applause broke out among the ranchers, and a few hats went into the air in relief. Marisol stood off to the side, ignoring the victorious mood. She knew that an arrest warrant was only the beginning. Morrison was cunning and had formidable resources. Securing a conviction would require diligence and unwavering courage, qualities she believed she possessed, though at times the cost felt steep. As the crowd dispersed, Hawthorne clapped a hand on her shoulder. "We'll be heading to Denver soon. Harlan wants everything laid out in official court records, and we need your testimony." Marisol nodded, gazing at the ledger she clutched. "I'll come. Edgar's work needs to see the light of day." She glanced at Ryder, who stared at the floor in sullen defeat. One chapter closes, she thought, but the final reckoning with Morrison still lies ahead. Morning arrived with a milky dawn light stretching across the Colorado landscape, illuminating Marisol Graywood's cabin and stable. Though the property still bore visible scars from the siege, shattered shutters, bullet holes, and charred patches of ground, there was also a sense of renewal. Marisol felt it in the quiet hush of the pines, and the way Hollis, her dun mare, calmly lipped at hay despite all the chaos she had recently endured. 3 days had passed since the preliminary hearing in Evergreen Gap, where Jonah Ryder's confession provided enough cause for a formal warrant against the powerful railroad baron Sebastian Morrison. In those intervening days, Marisol had kept busy repairing damaged sections of her cabin and helping the sheriff's deputies track down any lingering outlaws who might be hiding in the woods. She discovered one man, half-starved and delirious, crouched near a creek. He surrendered without a fight. Another was spotted limping off toward the distant hills. Whether or not he survived, no one could be certain, but at least the immediate threat around her property had abated. Now Sheriff Hawthorne had arranged for Marisol to travel with him to Denver, where Judge Harlan would convene a more formal session of court. The plan was to transport Jonah Ryder and a couple of his key associates, along with the evidence that Edgar Graywood had compiled. Marisol had spent the better part of the night sifting through documents, cross-referencing them with old maps that Edgar had once annotated. Each line of his tidy handwriting felt like a whisper from the past, urging her onward. She took a final walk around the perimeter of her land before leaving. The hush of early morning made every sound. Her footsteps, the rustle of pine needles, the distant call of a hawk seemed amplified. She paused at the spot where Edgar was buried, a simple wooden marker that read, "Edgar Graywood, honesty above all." Kneeling, she placed a hand on the weathered wood, recalling their shared dream of building a fair life on the frontier. "I'm taking your fight to the city now," she said softly. "I'll see it through." When she returned to the cabin, a small group awaited her: Hawthorne, Deputy Clark, and Nelson. They had come with 2 horses for extra supplies, plus a modest wagon carrying the locked trunk of evidence. A second wagon, more secure and guarded by armed deputies, held Jonah Ryder and a man named Royce, one of Ryder's henchmen who was coherent enough to testify about Morrison's involvement. Both prisoners glowered behind iron bars fitted onto the wagon sides, their wrists shackled to prevent any escape attempt. Marisol took one last look at her homestead. She felt a pang of reluctance to leave it vulnerable, but she had wired a note to a trusted neighbor who agreed to keep an eye on the property. Besides, most of Ryder's men were accounted for, and the rest had scattered. The real danger now lay in Denver's corridors of influence, where Morrison's money and allies could thwart their quest for justice. Locking her door and checking the stable latch, she mounted Hollis. With a determined nod to Hawthorne, she said, "Let's end what Edgar started." Sheriff Hawthorne touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Denver's a 2-day ride, maybe 3 if we're slowed by the prisoners. Stay sharp, everyone. Morrison's reach is long, and we don't know if he's already placed men along the routes." With that warning, their small convoy set out, hooves crunching on the gravel path that wound away from Marisol's land. She carried her rifle across her back, her sidearm at her belt, and the memory of Edgar's unwavering principles in her heart. They made steady progress along the narrow roads that branched through wooded hills and rolling meadows. While the first day passed without incident, Marisol remained ever vigilant. Each time they skirted a bend or passed a thicket, she scanned for any hint of ambush. Hawthorne had posted Deputy Clark at the front, with Nelson driving the evidence wagon in the middle, and Marisol riding near the rear to keep watch on the prisoner's wagon. Jonah Ryder sat rigid in his restraints, occasionally casting angry glares at Marisol or the sheriff. Royce, on the other hand, looked more resigned, his eyes downcast as though he already regretted the life choices that led him here. A few times, Marisol overheard them muttering to each other, but Ryder gave Royce curt orders to keep quiet. Late in the afternoon, they reached a broad river crossing. Its banks were lined with smooth stones, and the water swirled with deceptive speed. Nelson pulled the wagon's reins, bringing the train to a halt. "Sheriff," he called, The current's stronger than usual. We might need to find a shallower spot or risk the crossing as it is." Hawthorne rode up to the water's edge, studied the swirling eddies, and frowned. "We can't afford a big detour. Let's do a test run. Clark, you lead your horse across to gauge the depth, then we'll take the wagons one at a time." As the deputy prodded his mount into the river, Marisol took position on a slight rise to watch for trouble, scanning the tree line. Her nerves prickled when she spotted a movement among the pines across the river, a quick flash of color or motion, gone almost before she registered it. Reflexively, she eased her rifle off her shoulder. Could be a traveler or a hunter, she told herself. But after everything she had endured, she wasn't inclined to dismiss potential dangers. Clark signaled from midstream, the water lapping around his horse's flank. "Seems passable," he yelled back. "Just watch your wheels on the rocks." One by one, the wagons began fording the river. Nelson drove first, carefully steering around submerged boulders. Marisol and Hawthorne kept watch on the banks. Ryder and Royce were helpless to do anything from the confines of their locked cage, though Ryder craned his neck as if searching for a chance to exploit. Halfway across, the wagon with the trunk of evidence lurched over a hidden stone, jolting violently. Nelson cursed, wrestling the reins as the horses whinnied in alarm. Marisol spurred Hollis forward, ready to help if the wagon tipped. It rocked on two wheels for a heart-stopping moment before crashing back down. Cold water splashed across Nelson's boots and soaked the trunk's lower boards, but the wagon stayed upright. That was when the first bullet whined past Marisol's head, lodging itself in the riverbank behind her. "Ambush!" she shouted, diving off to the side as a second shot struck the water in front of Hawthorne's horse. Chaos erupted. The deputies scrambled, while Ryder let out a barking laugh from inside the bars. Clearly someone else had taken an interest in this convoy, someone who didn't want them reaching Denver with evidence intact. Marisol spurred Hollis behind a fallen log near the water's edge, using it as makeshift cover. She peered through the tree line, seeking the muzzle flash of the hidden shooter. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. Another shot cracked, this time splintering a branch inches above the sheriff's hat. Hawthorne ducked and pulled his horse behind a boulder, shouting for the deputies to do the same. "Clark, Nelson, get those wagons across," he roared. "Marisol, see if you can return fire." Nelson whipped the reins to urge his horses to move faster, wheels crunching over the rocky riverbed. Clark helped push the second wagon, a precarious maneuver with the caged outlaws jolting inside. Ryder cursed as he was thrown about, but Marisol had no time to relish his discomfort. She focused on locating the shooter. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of a figure shifting in the undergrowth, possibly two figures. She brought her rifle up, but the angle was bad. They fired again, hitting the water near the front wagon's wheel. Sparks flew from a submerged rock, and the horses reared in panic, nearly toppling the evidence wagon. Nelson held tight, knuckles white on the reins. "Steady," Marisol whispered to herself, remembering her wartime training. "Breathe in. Exhale slow." She adjusted her aim to the spot where the second muzzle flash had appeared. Just as she squeezed the trigger, the attacker shifted, and her bullet chewed into pine bark instead. A man cried out, a sure sign she'd clipped him, though not fatally. That partial hit was enough to spook them. Through her iron sights, she saw shapes dart deeper into the trees. One fired a covering shot that whizzed past her ear. Then they melted into the forest shadows. Within seconds, the assault was over, the faint sound of retreating footsteps swallowed by rustling branches. Hawthorne reined in next to her, scanning the opposite bank. "You see how many?" he asked, chest heaving. "At least two," Marisol replied, lowering her rifle. "Might have been more, but they were decent shots, not amateurs." A sense of grim apprehension settled over the group. The possibility that Morrison had dispatched another team to intercept them on the way to Denver loomed large. Ryder, still locked in the wagon, glared but said nothing. Royce cradled his bandaged arm, clearly shaken by the rough crossing and the gunshots. Eventually, they managed to get both wagons to the far bank. Water dripped from the carriage wheels, and the trunk containing Edgar's records was wet but intact. Clark and Nelson quickly checked the horses for injuries, finding only minor cuts. Hawthorne dismounted to examine the muddy footprints at the tree line, brow furrowed. "They retreated that way," he murmured. "Given how they shot, I'd guess they're either hired guns or ex-soldiers. Could be part of Morrison's retinue, Or just local bandits who recognize an opportunity? Hard to say. Marisol wiped sweat from her brow. We have to keep moving. They know which route we're taking. If they regroup or signal others, we could face another ambush. Hawthorne nodded in agreement, then turned to the prisoner's wagon. Ryder, he called. Any idea who might have hired folks to stop us? Ryder shrugged with forced nonchalance. Could be any number of men on Morrison's payroll, or maybe folks with their own grudges. This territory is full of them. The sheriff's jaw tightened. We can't assume this was a random attack. We'll stay on alert. He beckoned to the group, and they resumed their journey, traveling further away from the river and seeking a more defensible campsite before nightfall. Despite the renewed tension, Marisol felt a flicker of satisfaction that at least some of the attackers had been driven off empty-handed. But the road to Denver would be long, and if Morrison's agents lurked in the shadows, more trouble was almost guaranteed. The documents in that trunk were too important and too damning for the corrupt to ignore. They made camp just before dusk at a small clearing bordered by rugged bluffs. Hawthorne picked the site specifically for its defensibility, one open side that they could watch easily, and a rocky barrier behind them. The wagons were arranged in a loose semicircle, with the prisoner wagon nearer the bluff so no one could approach it unseen in the night. While Nelson and Clark tended to the horses, Marisol and Hawthorne scouted the perimeter. The tall pines swayed under a rising wind, and the temperature dropped noticeably after sunset. Marisol took note of the scuffs on the rocky ground, signs that travelers occasionally use this clearing. She hoped it wasn't a known bandit rendezvous. Later, they gathered around a modest fire. Even Ryder and Royce received some of the meal, hardtack biscuits and strips of salted meat. No one said much. The earlier ambush weighed heavily on them, and the usual casual banter of a camp was replaced by watchful silence. After finishing her meager portion, Marisol checked on the trunk of evidence, ensuring the lock was still secure. The trunk was slightly water damaged from the river crossing, but the documents inside remained protected by oilcloth wrappers. Hawthorne assigned them watch rotations. Marisol volunteered for the first shift, content to let her mind remain alert rather than attempt restless sleep. She found a vantage point atop a small rise from which she could see the outlines of the wagons and the flicker of their small fire. The full moon cast silver light over the clearing, revealing ghostly shapes of tree trunks in the distance. Her thoughts drifted to Edgar, to the hope in his eyes whenever he spoke of fair land distribution and honest governance. She wished he could see that she was so close, perhaps days away, from bringing the man behind his death to justice. Yet she wondered if even this testimony would suffice. Morrison was cunning, wealthy, and well-connected. The hearing might produce an arrest warrant, only for him to vanish behind a wall of bribes and legal technicalities. After a couple of hours, Nelson relieved her. He rubbed sleep from his eyes and tried to grin, though worry made it half-hearted. Thanks, Mrs. Graywood, he said. I'll keep him safe. Marisol patted his shoulder. Wake me if anything happens. She settled into a spot near the campfire, resting her back against a wagon wheel. Jonah, Ryder, and Royce were only a few feet away, separated by iron bars. Ryder sat with his back to her, arms folded. Royce hunched near the wagon's corner. The day's tension and the previous fights had drained them all. Marisol felt her lids growing heavy. Just as she began to drift off, a low voice caught her attention. Hey, Graywood. She turned to see Ryder glancing at her from over his shoulder, his tone grudgingly subdued. I hope you know. Morrison won't give up easily. She studied him under the moon's glow. I'm prepared for that. Ryder exhaled, some internal conflict flickering across his face. I believed in his promises once, thought I'd carve out a piece of land for myself, maybe even get back on my feet. Ended up just another hired gun. Don't think you can scare him like you did me. He's got deeper pockets and men who won't hesitate. Marisol held his gaze. We all make choices. You made yours, I'm making mine. She tightened her grip on her sidearm, letting the statement stand as both acknowledgement and warning. Turning away from him, she let exhaustion carry her off, though her dreams were laced with images of Morrison's forces waiting on the road ahead. Morning arrived in a blaze of orange that silhouetted the rocky bluffs. The convoy rose early, keen to cover ground before any lurking threat could organize. Hawthorne roused Jonah, Ryder, and Royce, offering each a minimal breakfast. The men ate in sullen silence, shackled arms limiting their movements. Even so, Marisol caught riders' occasional glances toward the evidence wagon, as if weighing a last-ditch escape plan. They broke camp efficiently, saddling horses, checking harnesses, and ensuring that the trunk of evidence was still locked tight. Marisol and Deputy Clark performed a quick perimeter sweep, then returned to find Hawthorne already prodding the group forward. The sheriff was eager to reach Denver, or at least a more populated region where an ambush would be riskier for potential attackers. The day's travel took them through rolling prairies dotted with stunted pines and clusters of boulders. Occasionally, they passed ranch houses or small homesteads. At one such place, a modest farm with a single horse in a makeshift corral, Hawthorne stopped to greet the owners. They eyed the wagon full of prisoners warily, but he managed to glean some news. The homesteaders mentioned spotting strange riders in the area, men who seemed to be scouting for something. They hadn't approached, but their presence alarmed the family. Each new report of suspicious riders heightened the sense of urgency in Marisol's gut. The further they went, the more she wondered if Morrison himself was holed up somewhere, orchestrating new ways to sabotage them. She forced herself to remain calm, reminding herself that every yard they traveled shortened the distance to Denver, where the eyes of the law would offer some protection. After midday, they reached a stretch of lonely road with little cover other than tall grasses. The sun beat down, making the horses sweat and the prisoners wilt under its glare. Marisol rode at the rear, scanning the horizon. Jonah Ryder looked faint, his face pale from the heat, yet he still managed to glare at her whenever their gazes met. Royce mostly kept his head bowed, as though resigned to whatever fate awaited him. Hawthorne urged them to pick up the pace. Nelson flicked the reins, the wheels rattling. A shimmering haze rose from the ground, creating mirages that danced at the edges of Marisol's vision. She found herself longing for a shady grove, any respite from the merciless sun. Without warning, Hawthorne raised his hand for them to halt. Marisol strained her eyes to see what he'd spotted. In the distance, a solitary rider approached, trailing a small dust cloud behind. No immediate sign of a larger posse, but tension rippled through the group. She urged Hollis alongside the sheriff. As the figure neared, they saw a woman on a dapple gray horse, both exhausted from travel. The woman wore a dusty coat and carried a holstered pistol. When she stopped at a respectful distance, she raised her hands to show no ill intent. "Sheriff Hawthorne?" she called in a voice that sounded parched. "Name's Miriam Kestrel. I'm a Pinkerton agent out of Chicago." That pronouncement caught everyone off guard, especially Marisol. Pinkerton agents were known for their skill in detective work and for being privately hired by railroad interests or wealthy patrons. Was this an ally or another threat? Hawthorne gave a cautious nod, one hand on his revolver. "What's your business here?" Miriam dismounted, wiping sweat from her brow. "I've been tracking certain arrangements involving Sebastian Morrison. My employer is an investor who got swindled. I've uncovered evidence suggesting Morrison has hired mercenaries to intercept a convoy carrying testimony against him. If you're the ones transporting that evidence, you're in grave danger." Marisol and the sheriff exchanged wary looks. Could this be a trap or a stroke of luck? The Pinkerton agent's posture and scuffed attire indicated she'd been riding hard. Her horse's flanks trembled with fatigue. She certainly looked earnest, but caution was second nature by now. Hawthorne cleared his throat. "We appreciate the warning, Miss Kestrel, but how do we know you're not working for Morrison yourself?" Miriam reached into her coat and carefully withdrew a folded paper bearing an official seal. "My credentials, and a letter from Judge Harlan." He suspected Morrison might hire additional enforcers, so he asked the Pinkerton agency for assistance. "I've been on Morrison's trail for weeks. You can read it yourself." The sheriff examined the documents, then showed them to Marisol. In neat script, there was indeed a message from Judge Harlan, requesting Pinkerton's support in safeguarding crucial testimony. Marisol felt a rush of relief. Perhaps they had gained an unexpected ally. But she also knew that backup from Pinkerton came with its own complexities, especially if the agency had ties to powerful railroad interests. Still, an extra gun, particularly one loyal to the law, might tip the balance in their favor. Hawthorne handed the papers back. "All right, Miss Kestrel, welcome aboard. But if this is some trick, you'll find we don't take kindly to betrayal." Miriam just nodded, remounting her horse with stiff movements. "I understand. For your sake, I hope we're not too late. Morrison isn't one to leave outcomes to chance." Accepting Miriam Kestrel's offer of help changed the complexion of their journey. Now they traveled with an informed Pinkerton agent, whose insight into Morrison's broader schemes proved invaluable. As they covered more miles of dusty road, Miriam shared tidbits of information. How Morrison had once bribed a Chicago official to bury certain land transfer records, and how he employed an extensive network of informants to keep tabs on potential threats. She also revealed that several attempts had been made to sabotage Judge Harlan's travel to Denver. Luckily, none had succeeded. Marisol listened intently, feeling both alarmed and oddly comforted. It reinforced what Edgar's notes suggested, that Morrison's operations were sprawling and well-funded, but also that more people than she realized were pushing back. Perhaps justice wasn't as solitary a quest as she had once believed. Meanwhile, Jonah Ryder watched Miriam's arrival with guarded curiosity. During one of their rest stops, Marisol overheard him asking Hawthorne in a low voice, "What do Pinkertons want with Morrison? They used to do his bidding, not hold him to account." Hawthorne replied brusquely that times were changing and some Pinkertons wouldn't be bought. Ryder responded with a grunt of skepticism. By late afternoon of the next day, they reached a more established road that veered west, leading to Denver's outskirts. The terrain shifted, scattered pines giving way to grasslands and occasional farmland. They encountered more travelers, merchants, farmers in wagons, even a stagecoach carrying passengers. Hawthorne warned everyone to stay alert, but the constant flow of people made a large-scale ambush less likely. Miriam periodically rode ahead, scouting vantage points. Nelson, still driving the evidence wagon, seemed relieved by her presence, as she radiated a calm confidence reminiscent of Marisol's own demeanor. Deputy Clark also looked more at ease, seeing that they were finally entering better policed regions. Despite this relative security, Marisol couldn't shed her unease. She'd spent months preparing for a confrontation with Morrison, and now it loomed on the horizon. She wondered what her life would look like afterward. Would she remain on her homestead, or would the impetus to fight corruption carry her elsewhere? Perhaps into a formal role assisting men like Hawthorne and Judge Harlan. A pang of longing for peace nudged at her, the kind she and Edgar once dreamed of. But such peace might not exist in a world where cunning men manipulated the law for profit. As the sun dipped low, Hawthorne proposed they stop at a roadside inn for the night, one large enough to accommodate the prisoners securely. The inn, called Wayfarer's Rest, appeared well-traveled, with a spacious barn where they could keep the wagons and horses. The innkeeper's eyebrows rose at the sight of Jonah Ryder in shackles, but he nodded curtly when Hawthorne flashed his sheriff's badge. They secured private rooms for themselves and made arrangements to lock Ryder and Royce in a sturdy storage space with barred windows. 2 deputies would stand guard, alternating with Marisol and Miriam through the night. The innkeeper, an older man named Porter, was assured a generous fee for his trouble. He seemed content so long as no bullets flew inside his establishment. Over a hearty supper of stew and bread in the common room, the group discussed their final approach to Denver. Miriam revealed that Judge Harlan had set a preliminary hearing date within the next week. Morrison, however, had not been formally served notice yet, as they preferred not to tip him off too early. The judge hoped to catch him off guard, possibly even with a swift arrest. Marisol leaned back in her chair, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "What if Morrison flees the territory as soon as he senses danger?" she asked. "He could vanish into another state, or even head south of the border." Miriam's expression was grim. "That's a risk, but we've lined up watchers at key points, train stations, major roads. If he tries to run, he'll have to evade a lot of eyes. Besides, a man like Morrison craves power. Running away would be an admission of weakness he might not stomach." Hawthorne grunted in agreement. "Still, we can't underestimate him. He's killed before, or had others do it for him. We have to assume he'll try again if cornered." Marisol nodded. The shadows of the flickering lanterns danced across the table, mirroring the quiet dread they all felt. The next days would be pivotal, the final steps of a long and brutal road. If fate was kind, and if they stayed one step ahead of Morrison's schemes, they might finally see Edgar's vision of justice realize. The last leg of their journey took them onto the main highway leading into Denver. What had once been a dusty track now bristled with new developments. Telegraph lines, stage stops, and clusters of newly built homes that hinted at the city's rapid growth. Even from miles away, the skyline was visible, a haze of construction, chimneys, and the faint spires of public buildings. For Marisol, who had lived so long in the solitude of her remote ridge, Denver felt like another world entirely, bustling and loud. They arrived under gray, overcast skies with a drizzle that slicked the streets and dampened their clothes. Hawthorne led the wagons through crowded thoroughfares, mindful of onlookers who gawked at the caged outlaws. Miriam Kestrel rode ahead, weaving among horse-drawn carriages and pedestrians to clear a path. The city smelled of wet cobblestones, coal smoke, and 1,000 mingled scents from markets and workshops. Their destination was the sturdy, newly expanded courthouse near the city center. Built from stone blocks, it loomed over the nearby buildings, a testament to the territory's ambition for law and order. Marisol's heart thudded as they pulled into the courtyard, where a detachment of marshals awaited them. She saw the tension etched on Jonah Ryder's face. Maybe he sensed that after all his violence, his final stand would be inside these walls. Under the marshal's watchful eyes, they unloaded the trunk of evidence. Hawthorne personally carried it up the courthouse steps, with Marisol at his side. She clutched her rifle in one hand and her sidearm at her belt, drawing curious glances from the marshals who recognized the steely determination in her eyes. Miriam joined them, presenting her Pinkerton credentials and confirming that Judge Harlan expected their arrival. As they entered the courthouse's echoing halls, Marisol felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief at having reached the seat of territorial justice, fear that Morrison's influence could still corrode these very corridors, and a deep sorrow that Edgar was not alive to witness this moment. She pulled herself straighter, focusing on the faint glimmer of hope that this hearing could finally bring the man behind her husband's death to account. Behind her, Jonah Ryder was escorted by 2 deputies, his gaze flickering across the imposing architecture. Whether he felt regret, bitterness, or sheer anger, Marisol couldn't tell. All she knew was that now, under the looming arches and carved stone pillars, the fight would shift from bullets to documents and sworn testimony. And yet that fight could be every bit as perilous if Morrison's cunning overshadowed their honesty. A hush fell over the small courtroom as Judge Bernard Harlan took his seat behind the polished oak bench. He was a tall, stern-faced man with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The chamber itself was modest compared to grander city courts, but it emanated a certain gravity. Marisol, seated beside Hawthorne at a table piled with Edgar's documents, felt every eye on her. On the opposite side sat Morrison's counsel, a lean, hawk-nosed attorney named Elijah Tarver, who perused some papers with a smirk of confidence. Only half an hour earlier, Tarver had attempted to delay the proceedings, citing that Morrison needed adequate time to prepare a defense. Judge Harlan coolly informed him that the hearing was merely to establish grounds for formal charges, not a full trial. If Tarver's client was truly interested in a fair process, he should appear willingly. That set the tone. Harlan would not be cowed. Jonah Ryder, shackled at a separate table, glowered at Tarver. He had no illusions about Morrison sending a top-tier lawyer to save him. The railroad baron's main goal, no doubt, was damage control. If Ryder was no longer useful, he would be cast aside, possibly even implicated. In Marisol's eyes, the entire dynamic felt like a high-stakes dance of power. The hearing opened with Hawthorne's account of how Ryder's gang had assaulted Marisol's homestead. He recounted the violence, the threats, and the evidence that tied them to Morrison's broader scheme of land theft. Next, Marisol was called to testify. She described the slow buildup of intimidation, culminating in the night-long siege at her cabin. She spoke clearly, her voice resonating through the chamber, detailing each step of Ryder's infiltration, the warnings she had given, and the final confrontation. At one point, Tarver tried to object to her characterization of events. "Your Honor, Ms. Graywood offers hearsay, attributing the assault to Mr. Morrison's instructions, but we have no direct proof that my client communicated with Ryder." Judge Harlan glanced at Marisol. "Ms. Graywood, can you present any documentary link between Mr. Morrison and Mr. Ryder?" Marisol allowed herself a tight smile. "Yes, Your Honor. My late husband, Edgar Graywood, compiled these letters and ledger entries showing land deeds processed under suspicious circumstances. We also have telegram receipts from a contact in Pinnerus City that match codes used by Jonah Ryder's associates, referencing Morrison's land acquisitions. She produced a crinkled telegram from the trunk, pointing to a set of coded phrases. This code repeats in Ryder's personal notes, notes we seized when he was arrested. And we have affidavits from local homesteaders who state they were harassed by men citing the interests of Morrison's railroad. Tarver muttered objections about circumstantial evidence, but Jonah Ryder's presence in shackles added weight to Marisol's claims. Miriam Kestrel also provided a Pinkerton analysis of financial transactions, linking Morrison's corporate accounts to shell companies that paid off men like Ryder. Though some evidence was indirect, the sheer volume created a compelling mosaic of wrongdoing. When Ryder took the stand, his initial reluctance gave way under the weight of probable conviction for his own crimes. He confirmed receiving instructions from a shadowy intermediary, but refused to name specifics. "Look," he finally growled, "I got paid through certain channels. I was told to push folks off certain lands. Morrison's name came up more than once. You do the math." Tarver tried to discredit Ryder's testimony by painting him as an embittered outlaw seeking a plea deal, but Judge Harlan did not seem swayed. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "We are not here to decide guilt or innocence in a final sense, but to determine if there's enough basis for charges. I find there is." The announcement rippled through the courtroom. Marisol felt her shoulders tense, anticipating what would follow. Judge Harlan turned to Tarver, his expression steeled. "Mr. Tarver, unless Mr. Morrison presents himself voluntarily, I will issue a warrant for his arrest. We have credible testimony and supporting documentation indicating conspiracy, fraud, and possibly homicide." Tarver spluttered about overreach and lack of direct evidence, but Harlan was unmoved. The gavel struck again. "Proceedings are adjourned until next week, by which time I expect Mr. Morrison to comply with his court summons, or face immediate apprehension." With that final pronouncement, the tension in the room escalated. Outside, the corridor buzzed with talk of an arrest warrant for one of the territory's most influential men. While some believed justice might finally catch up to Morrison, others whispered that a cornered snake often bites the hardest. Marisol merely gathered her papers, heart pounding. She was one step closer to vindicating Edgar's death, yet the greatest danger might be the next few days, as Morrison realized the net was closing in. The courthouse steps bristled with marshals and curious onlookers as Marisol, Hawthorne, and Miriam emerged. Tarver had stormed off, presumably to notify his client of the new legal trouble. Jonah Ryder was escorted by deputies back to his cell, while Royce, less central to the scheme, faced arraignment on lesser charges. Hawthorne signaled to Marisol and Miriam, beckoning them toward a quieter corner of the courtyard. "He'll strike back," Hawthorne murmured, eyes scanning the crowd. "Either Morrison or his hired hands. He won't just stroll into custody." Miriam nodded. "My Pinkerton contact said Morrison has been holed up at the Langley Hotel under an alias, likely finalizing deals to launder his assets or bribing key officials. Word of this hearing will reach him soon if it hasn't already." Marisol clutched Edgar's documents to her chest. They felt heavier than ever, like the weight of an entire territory's hope for fairness. "Then we don't have much time. We need to ensure he can't vanish. Is the governor aware?" Hawthorne exhaled. "The governor's staff has been informed, but whether that translates into real action is another question. Morrison's bribery runs deep. We'd be wise to handle this ourselves if we want it done right. Judge Harlan can issue the warrant, but enforcing it might fall to us in the federal marshals we trust." A rumble of thunder sounded overhead, clouds gathering in a sullen mass. The crowd began dispersing, some sprinting for cover as rain commenced in fat droplets. Marisol glanced at Hawthorne's serious expression. "Then let's do it. Let's find Morrison before he can run." Miriam tilted her head. "I have a lead on a man named Victor Lyle, one of Morrison's closest associates. He does much of Morrison's dirty work, managing payoff ledgers and forging land deeds. If we detain Lyle, we might force Morrison's hand." Hawthorne scratched his chin. "Where is he?" "Rumored to frequent a private gambling hall, the Royal Clover, owned by a petty crime boss who's in Morrison's pocket," Miriam replied. "He's there most evenings, collecting debts, meeting potential forgers. We can stage an arrest if we plan it right." Marisol's mind raced with old infiltration tactics. She thought of how to disguise an approach, the number of exits, the best vantage points to keep them from being ambushed. The ghost of her wartime training loomed, a reminder that stealth and cunning might still triumph over brute force. Hawthorne nodded. Then that's our next step. We corner Lyle tonight at the Royal Clover. We'll bring a couple of marshals we trust, plus you and Marisol if you're both willing. We'll keep this quiet, so no word leaks back to Morrison prematurely. Marisol's pulse quickened. She hadn't expected her journey to morph into a covert operation in Denver's underworld. Yet if it closed the net around Morrison, she was ready. "Count me in," she said firmly. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the courthouse's stone pillars. Rain pelted them in earnest, washing over the bustling streets. As they departed, each step carried a heightened sense of resolve and risk. If they succeeded in trapping Victor Lyle, Morrison's stronghold could crumble. But if they failed, Morrison might vanish into the night, carrying with him the final, mocking legacy of Edgar's death unavenged. That evening, the Royal Clover stood as a beacon of illicit allure in a backstreet district of Denver. Multicolored lanterns lit the entrance, their glow reflecting off puddles from the recent rain. Strains of lively piano music drifted through half-open doors, punctuated by the clink of gambling tokens. Despite its semi-hidden location, the place bustled with a crowd hungry for thrills. Sheriff Hawthorne, Deputy Clark, two trusted marshals, Irving and Sanchez, plus Miriam Kestrel and Marisol Graywood, waited in a shadowed alley nearby. They had decided on plainclothes to avoid drawing suspicion, each one carrying concealed weapons. Marisol wore a long coat that hid her sidearm and knives. Miriam carried official Pinkerton credentials in her vest pocket, ready to flash them if needed. They formulated a plan. Hawthorne and Clark would enter first, posing as gamblers. Once they spotted Victor Lyle, they'd signal the rest to slip in. The idea was to converge on Lyle quietly, block his escape routes, and escort him out before a full-scale shootout erupted. Marisol and Miriam would back them up from different angles, utilizing the confusion of the gambling floor. As the group separated, Marisol felt her heart pound with the same dread-laced excitement she once felt on Spectre Corps missions. She reminded herself of the stakes. Lyle's capture could unravel Morrison's entire operation, but if this went wrong, they might face a hail of gunfire in a crowded hall with innocent patrons at risk. Hawthorne and Clark vanished through the main entrance, the doorman barely glancing up from his bored expression. 5 minutes later, Miriam and Marisol followed, slipping in separately. The Royal Clover's interior was awash in red velvet drapes and flickering gaslight. Smoke from cigars and lamps created a hazy ambience, and the constant murmur of voices mingled with the jangle of a ragtime piano. Gamblers crowded the roulette tables, card games, and dice pits. The smell of whiskey, sweat, and tension hung in the air. Marisol circled the perimeter, scanning faces. She spotted Hawthorne pretending to chat with a croupier. Clark hovered near a roulette wheel, sipping from a glass. Miriam drifted toward a bar, eyes sharp beneath the brim of her hat. Then Marisol saw him, a wiry man with thin, angular features and meticulously combed hair. He wore a sleek vest adorned with a gold watch chain, a small flourish that matched the rumors of his vanity. This had to be Victor Lyle. He stood at a card table, watching the players more than the game, occasionally jotting notes in a small ledger. From the protective stance of two tough-looking men flanking him, Marisol guessed they were his hired muscle. Lyle radiated the self-assured aura of someone who believed himself untouchable. Catching Hawthorne's eye, she signaled discreetly, a tilt of her head in Lyle's direction. The sheriff nodded, handing a few coins to the croupier as if finishing a bet, then casually moved closer. Miriam did the same from the other side. Deputy Clark slipped behind the bar, presumably positioning to block an exit door. The two marshals lingered near the double doors leading to a back room. They converged in a tight wave. Lyle looked up, surprise flashing across his face. Hawthorne produced a folded document, a warrant for questioning. "Victor Lyle," he said, voice calm, "we need you to come with us." Lyle's goons started to reach for weapons, but Miriam drew faster, her Pinkerton badge displayed. "Stay where you are," she warned, leveling her revolver. Marisol flanked them, coat parted to reveal her own sidearm. Her stance radiated unspoken confidence. She had faced more dangerous foes than these. For a breathless instant, it seemed the room would explode in gunfire. Patrons paused their games, uncertain whether to flee or watch. One of Lyle's guards began to raise a pistol, but Marisol's glare and the presence of multiple armed officers halted him mid-motion. He let the pistol drop back into its holster. Lyle tried for a smirk, though sweat shone at his temples. "Is this some sort of joke? You have no authority." Hawthorne cut him off. "Territorial sheriff, Pinkerton agent, and federal marshals say otherwise. You're wanted for questioning in a fraud and conspiracy investigation. Now we can do this quietly, or we can tear this place apart." The tension crackled. Lyle's eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but every door was discreetly covered. Finally he muttered, "I'll cooperate. No need for theatrics." Marisol exhaled inwardly, relieved that bullets hadn't flown, but she remained alert. Men like Lyle often tried last-minute tricks. She and Miriam escorted him out, ignoring the buzzing whispers among the gamblers. They exited swiftly, depositing him into the waiting arms of Deputy Clark and the marshals in the alley. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the real question was how much Lyle would divulge, and how soon. Victor Lyle's interrogation took place in a spare office offered by the Denver marshals. A single lantern lit the cramped room, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lyle sat behind a wooden desk, cuffed to a metal ring bolted to the floor. Hawthorne, Miriam, and Marisol stood in front of him, their postures reflecting the high stakes. At first, Lyle bluffed and blustered. He claimed ignorance about Morrison's dealings, insisting he was merely a finance manager for various enterprises. When pressed on the suspicious ledgers and coded telegrams, he scoffed that they were mere rumors and coincidences. Hawthorne produced a battered logbook from the Royal Clover's safe, discovered during a swift post-arrest search. The entries matched aliases and amounts suspiciously similar to the sums Edgar Graywood had tracked. Lyle's face tightened at the sight. Slowly, the cracks in his facade appeared. "Look," Miriam said, voice measured. "We know Morrison's behind these land grab operations, forging deeds and bribing officials. We have bank records. We have testimony from men who carried out his dirty work. All that's missing is your cooperation. If you help us, the judge might consider leniency." Sobertom, Lyle's knuckles whitened on the arm of his chair. He glanced at Marisol, who regarded him with a quiet, unflinching stare. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Marisol spoke, her tone firm. "Then you go down with him. The difference is, he has money to hire top lawyers to cut deals. You're expendable. He won't lift a finger to save you." Silence roiled in the small room. The lamplight made Lyle's eyes glisten with worry. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I can show you some documents. Insurance I kept in case Morrison ever turned on me." Hawthorne's gaze sharpened. "Where?" "In a strong box at a boarding house by the West Rail Yard," Lyle admitted. "Under a false name. Inside, there's a ledger of payouts, plus signed letters from Morrison. Should be enough to make the judge very interested." Marisol's pulse quickened. This could be the final nail in Morrison's coffin. "Take us there," she demanded. "Now!" A trace of cunning lit Lyle's face. "Under one condition, guarantee me official protection. I don't want to end up like that poor fool Jonah Ryder, locked away with no hope." Hawthorne and Miriam exchanged glances. The vow of protection was not easily given, especially for someone so deeply involved. But if Lyle's evidence truly sealed the case, it might be worth it. "Help us bring Morrison to justice," Miriam said slowly, "and I'll recommend protective custody to Judge Harlan. But cross us, and you'll answer for everything." Lyle nodded, exhaling shakily. "Deal." A sense of resolve filled the room. This was the closest Marisol had come to exposing Morrison's darkest secrets. Yet an undercurrent of danger remained. Retrieving that strong box meant traversing Denver's labyrinth of back alleys, where Morrison's watchers could lurk. She squared her shoulders, warily anticipating the next move in a game where one misstep could be fatal. Night had fallen again by the time Marisol, Hawthorne, Miriam, and a small cadre of marshals escorted Victor Lyle to the boarding house near the West Rail Yard. The building stood in a working-class district, overshadowed by the looming silhouettes of train engines and rows of freight cars. Steam hissed from idle locomotives, and the night air smelled of coal dust. Hawthorne posted two marshals outside, instructing them to watch for signs of an ambush. Then the group entered the creaking lobby, where a sleepy clerk blinked in surprise at the late-night visitors. Lyle led them upstairs to a narrow hallway. He pointed to a door with peeling paint. "Room 9, he muttered. The corridor was cramped enough that they had to proceed single file. Marisol's senses heightened. Every footstep on the worn floorboards felt ominously loud. Miriam kept her hand near her revolver, scanning for threats. Lyle fished a key from his vest and inserted it into the lock. The room beyond was a cramped, sparsely furnished space with a single bed, a battered trunk, and a small table. A flickering oil lamp cast weak light across stained wallpaper. Lyle gestured to the trunk, kneeling to open it. Marisol and Hawthorne exchanged wary glances, poised to act if he tried something. Inside the trunk lay a plain wooden box bound by a metal clasp. Lyle opened it carefully, revealing a stack of papers and a small leather-bound ledger. He lifted the ledger. "This contains the names of officials, bank clerks, and notaries Morrison bought off. Initials, amounts, dates." He swallowed, glancing at Marisol. "I also have letters with Morrison's signature instructing me to handle certain disputed properties." Marisol stepped closer, scanning a random page. Names, sums in neat rows, references to land deeds that matched Edgar's notes. Tension coiled in her chest. This was exactly what they needed, a direct link to Morrison's signature and instructions. She glanced at Hawthorne. His face hardened with determination. Then the silence shattered. A gunshot exploded from somewhere below, followed by a crash. Miriam whipped around, drawing her weapon. "Downstairs!" she hissed. Another shot boomed, splintering the banister at the top of the staircase. "Get down!" Hawthorne barked, pushing Lyle behind the trunk. Marisol dove to the floor as bullets hammered the doorframe. Grunts and shouts echoed. Down the hallway, a shadowy figure loomed, muzzle flashing in the dimness. The clerk screamed, and the floorboards shook under racing footsteps. Caught in a crossfire, the marshals outside the building had presumably been attacked. Marisol recognized the typical tactic. Trap them upstairs with limited exit routes. She crawled to the doorway, returning fire. She glimpsed at least two armed attackers near the stairwell, one leaning over the railing to shoot upward. A bullet whizzed past her ear, burying itself in the wall. Hawthorne flanked the other side of the door, peppering the hallway with cover fire. Miriam, pinned inside, tried to shield Lyle. He clutched the ledger to his chest as if it were a lifeline. "Marisol!" the sheriff yelled over the gunfire. "We're cut off!" She surveyed their desperate situation. The single window in the room offered a potential escape, but jumping from the second floor was risky. Then she spotted a rickety fire escape outside. If they could smash the window and slip onto it, they might descend to the alley. "Go!" she shouted, gesturing to the window. "Miriam, take Lyle, I'll cover you." Hawthorne reloaded, firing another volley into the hallway. A pained cry indicated at least one attacker was hit. In the confusion, Miriam dragged Lyle to the window, prying it open. Wood cracked, and cold night air flooded the room. Marisol knelt by the doorway, rifle aimed at the hall. She caught sight of a figure crouching low, creeping closer. Her finger squeezed the trigger. Another shot thundered. The figure slumped, dropping his weapon. But more footsteps pounded on the stairs. This assault wasn't random. They must have known about Lyle's strongbox or recognized the marshals. Possibly Morrison's men. Behind her, glass shattered as Lyle struggled with the fire escape's hinged ladder. Miriam hissed, "We're almost clear." But then a new volley of bullets hammered the outside walls, likely from shooters in the alley. Pinned on two fronts, Marisol felt a surge of the old Spectre Corps adrenaline. She had been in worse corners behind enemy lines. Gritting her teeth, she barked a single command to Hawthorne. "Basement!" If the building had one, they could slip down through it and avoid the alley. Hawthorne nodded, glimpsing a door in the hallway behind the crumpled forms of attackers. But that meant fighting their way down the corridor under fire. With a grim smile, Marisol braced for a final push, knowing the ledger in Lyle's hands might be their only hope to bring Morrison to justice. The next 30 seconds felt like a lifetime of chaos. Marisol signaled Hawthorne, both of them rising in tandem to unleash a barrage of covering fire. Bullets sparked against the corridor walls, forcing the attackers to recoil. Miriam took the chance, yanking Lyle away from the window and ushering him into the hallway behind Marisol. The four of them pressed forward, Marisol and Hawthorne leading, Miriam guarding Lyle. One attacker, crouched near the stairwell, lunged up with a knife. Marisol pivoted, smacking the blade aside with the stock of her rifle. In a swift motion, she slammed the butt into his temple, knocking him senseless. Then she fired down the stairs at another gunman, who tried to line up a shot. He toppled backward, crashing onto the landing. Smoke and dust filled the air, stinging Marisol's eyes. Hawthorne took point, methodically reloading his revolver. Each shot echoed thunderously, the muzzle flashes revealing glimpses of disoriented attackers. Miriam kicked aside a dropped firearm, her other hand holding Lyle's collar to keep him from bolting. They passed the lobby, where the clerk lay cowering behind a desk. At least one marshal was down, unconscious or worse. Another pressed himself against a corner, firing at men outside who peppered the windows with bullets. The boarding house had become a war zone. Miriam pointed to a door behind the reception counter. That might lead to a cellar. She and Lyle dashed for it while Marisol and Hawthorne covered them, firing at silhouettes beyond the shattered front windows. When they reached the door, Miriam kicked it open. The stench of damp earth and mildew wafted out. "Basement," she confirmed. The group barreled down a rickety staircase into darkness. Marisol found a lantern on a shelf, quickly lighting it while Hawthorne locked the door behind them. The distant echo of gunshots continued upstairs. At least two marshals still fought to secure the building, and Marisol felt a pang of guilt leaving them behind. But if they lost Lyle's ledger now, Morrison would effectively win. In the flickering lantern glow, they discovered a cramped basement cluttered with crates and barrels. A faint draft indicated another exit, maybe a hidden door to the alley. Lyle clutched the ledger as if his life depended on it, and in many ways it did. "Search for a hatch or some opening," Hawthorne urged, sliding among the barrels. After a few tense moments, Miriam found a low wooden panel that shifted when she pushed it. Sure enough, beyond it lay a short tunnel or drainage passage that angled upward. Marisol grimaced. "Could lead out, or it could lead nowhere. But it's better than going back." They crawled in single file, the lantern's glow revealing dripping stone walls and shallow water. Lyle cursed under his breath, but he kept the ledger tucked inside his coat. The passage was tight, forcing them to shuffle on hands and knees. Every drip of water felt loud in the suffocating silence, though the muffled thuds of gunfire upstairs reminded them of the urgency. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a rusted grate. Hawthorne tested it with a shoulder and found it partially loose. With effort, he and Marisol pried it free, revealing an alley lit by a lone street lamp. Rain had soaked the cobblestones and the narrow space reeked of garbage and stale spirits. One by one they emerged, scanning for hostiles. The night air felt shockingly cool after the suffocating basement. No immediate attackers waited, though distant shouts suggested the fight still raged near the boarding house. Miriam motioned to a side street. "We can circle around and link up with the marshals from the far side. Or we get Lyle straight to the courthouse." Lyle, panting heavily, shook his head. "Courthouse," he gasped. "You promised me protection." Marisol met Hawthorne's eyes. A moment of decision. Despite the ongoing battle at the boarding house, saving Lyle and his ledger took precedence. If they lost him now, Morrison could still wriggle free. "Let's go," she said, adjusting her rifle. Sticking to the shadows, they slipped away into the night. Adrenaline propelled them through back alleys until the chaos faded behind them. Eventually, they hailed a passing wagon, commandeering it in the name of the law. In hushed tones, they instructed the startled driver to head for the courthouse post-haste. As they clambered aboard, Marisol glanced at Lyle, who clutched the evidence like a lifeline. She felt a grim satisfaction. This might be the break needed to end Morrison's reign of corruption, if they could survive a little longer. The wagon's wheels rattled on the slick cobblestones, carrying them toward the final confrontation. In her mind's eye, Marisol saw Edgar's face, heard his voice reminding her of honesty above all else. They were almost there, almost at the threshold of the justice he had died believing in. From my own perspective, this story isn't just about triumphing over villains. It's also about the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to give up their land, their dreams, or their sense of justice. Marisol Greywood's bravery shows us that one determined person can make all the difference, even when facing impossible odds. Thank you for following this journey, from tense showdowns in remote cabins to the pursuit of truth in bustling courtrooms. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which parts gripped you most? What did you find inspiring or surprising? Share your comments below so we can continue this conversation and keep these stories alive. Feel free to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more adventures on our channel.